I want to welcome everybody to the National Academy of Sciences building for today's event. Before we get started on the event, I want to acknowledge the scientists and policymakers who have been instrumental in the negotiation of the Biological and Toxins Weapons Convention in the early 1970s and all efforts since then. We would be remiss if we did not acknowledge some of our scientists involved since the very beginning, such as Dr. Matthew Messelson, Dr. Joshua Lederberg, both of whom are Academy's members, and also members of the Committee on International Security and Arms Control. Also want to acknowledge Dr. Robert Matthews from Australia, Dr. John Pascal Zanders from Germany, and Dr. Julian Perry Robinson from the United Kingdom. We thank you for joining us here in this building to celebrate the 50 years of the BTWC and 100 years of the 1925 Geneva Protocol, and look forward to thinking ahead and thinking to the future of how we're going to counter biological weapons threats during the next several decades. This event is being co-hosted by the Board on Life Sciences, which I run, and the Committee on International Security and Arms Control, which is led by Michael Lowenthal, who is unable to join us today. He sends his regards to everyone and hopes to re-engage in the next time we meet. We would also like to introduce you to the team who planned the event, and I don't know if everybody's actually in the room, so I'll just name them. So Dr. Tricia Tukolsky, who is right up front here, who is a program officer in the Board on Life Sciences and also the brains behind the event. So all compliments go to her and her team. Dr. Rania Kosti, who is a part of the U.S. Secretariat of the Inter-Academy Partnership and also directs the Board on International Scientific Organizations back there. And Maggie McCarthy, who is a research associate in CSAC. Tricia will be your facilitator for today, so the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kavita. And thank you all for being here today, in person or online. We have a full house both on Zoom and in the room. And I'm sure many people tuning in via the webcast. And we have a great lineup of speakers today. So before we get started with the program, I'll read just a few quick housekeeping notes. So I first want to make everyone aware that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded and will be made available to watch on the event page after today. Participants in the room can use the aisle microphone to ask questions, and then Zoom participants can just use their Zoom hand raise option to indicate that they'd like to speak, and then the moderator will call on you. For everyone who is tuning in through the live stream, an updated agenda for today and the speaker bios can be found on the webpage. Any comments and ideas made today should be attributed to individual speakers and not their organizations unless otherwise stated. And finally, any thoughts shared during the meeting today should not be interpreted as the opinion of the National Academies, and any meeting discussions are not intended to lead to consensus recommendations. Okay, so without any further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Stone, who will introduce our first panel. Richard is a special advisor for science, diplomacy, and engagement for the Human Frontier Science Program Organization. He also serves as a senior international correspondent for Science Magazine, where his writing has been featured or has featured datelines from challenging reporting environments such as Cuba, Iran, and North Korea. We're so happy he agreed to moderate this first panel, and I will now pass it over to you, Richard. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Tricia. Really a pleasure to be here. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. For this first panel, small but mighty panel, I'm going to introduce our two panelists and then invite them to give a few opening remarks, followed by a Q&A amongst ourselves, and then time permitting, we'll open it to the floor for questions. I think we'll have time. So to my right is Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. She served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security from July 2021 to December 2024. As Undersecretary, she oversaw three bureaus: the Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability Bureau, the International Security and Nonproliferation Bureau, and the Political Military Affairs Bureau. Ambassador Jenkins previously served in the Obama administration as Special Envoy and Coordinator for threat reduction programs from July 2009 until January 2017, in which she coordinated efforts on threat reduction programs alongside international programs that prevent non-state actors from acquiring chemical precursors, pathogens, nuclear material, and radiological sources to develop weapons of mass destruction. From 2014 to 2017, Ambassador Jenkins led diplomatic efforts to promote the Global Health Security Agenda, a consortium that builds capacity to prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease threats. Ambassador Jenkins has a PhD in international relations from the University of Virginia, as well as graduate degrees in law and public health. Welcome, Ambassador. We have on Zoom, I believe, is she going to be on the screen? Ah, there she is. Sonia Ben Ogrim Gormley. She is an associate professor and deputy director of the Biodefense Graduate Program at the Shara School of Policy and Government, George Mason University. She holds a PhD in economics and graduate degrees in strategy and defense policy, foreign languages, economics, and law. Currently, Dr. Ogrim Gormley, her research focuses on issues at the intersection of science and security, including safety and security threats posed by emerging technologies, the social and technical dimensions of bioweapons development, and the challenges of managing large scientific and weapons projects. She's the author of Barriers to Bioweapons, The Challenges of Expertise and Organization for Weapons Development, and a co-author of a documentary on Soviet bioweapon scientists called The Anthrax Diaries. Welcome, Dr. Ogrim Gormley. So we're going to start, as I said, with some opening remarks, just to set the stage, looking back and forward at the 50 years of the Bioweapons Convention. So Ambassador Jenkins, why don't you start us off?
Great, thank you, Richard. And first, I want to thank the National Academies for inviting me and to be a part of this discussion. It's great to see so many friends and former colleagues in the audience and so many experts on the issue of the Biological Weapons Convention and bioscience overall. I think we should look at this as a celebration. It's an anniversary. It's an anniversary of many years of having the Treaty on Biological Weapons. And I think that's a milestone, obviously, and something that should be celebrated. I know that a lot of the work that I have done and other colleagues around the room and probably listening online, we focus a lot on what can be bad, how our science and how the great knowledge that we acquire can sometimes be used in a negative way that hurts humankind. But I also think that at this celebration, we should recognize the value of the treaty and what it's actually been able to do. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but let's recognize this is a celebration of many years of this convention in force. And so that's one of the things I want to bring to the table early on as we have this day of discussions about challenges that do also exist regarding the BWC throughout the years and currently. We also should recognize the importance of this issue. I always thought that the biological weapons, these issues are very important. And sometimes people who work in these fields often say that the third child of the three treaties, you had the nuclear, the chemical, and the bio doesn't get nearly as much attention and doesn't have the inspection regime. And but we have seen what happens, right? We all have lived through COVID-19 and we saw what happened with Ebola. We saw what happened with COVID-19. So we know and we've lived through the experiences of what happens when you have an infectious disease out there and how it affects the global community and everyone around the world and the financial issues. We're still dealing with the results of COVID-19, even though we're not wearing the masks anymore and you're not staying home as we used to, but we're still living with the aftermath of COVID-19. So if anything, we want that to continue to be a wake-up call that we need to focus on these issues, and these issues of biosecurity and BWC are just as important as other issues we look at in weapons of mass destruction. And so for me, we have to continue to ring the bell about this, and we'll talk more. I think some of the other panels will talk about challenges like AI and emerging technologies and the many other things that we need to deal with in terms of strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention and making sure that everyone around the world recognizes the importance of biological weapons and what can lead to it. But we also recognize that we have to deal with things like geopolitics. And I think that has come to be a problem, obviously, in many of the things that are going on, trying to push the importance of the BWC in multilateral forums. And unfortunately, the geopolitics with Russia, for example, in Ukraine, it creeps in everything. It creeps into so much work that we do in a multilateral environment. So that, among other things that we need to deal with, and we'll talk more about that in this panel and throughout the day, that's the reality of the situation. So just wanted to say, let's celebrate. It's a milestone and it has achieved quite a bit, and we'll talk more about that. But we do recognize that there are challenges that exist.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dr. Gormley, would you like to make a few opening remarks?
Sure. Thank you. I'd like to thank also the National Academies for inviting me. This is indeed an important treaty, and it's worth celebrating it. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I would like to join Ambassador Jenkins in reiterating the importance of the treaty and the importance of celebrating its achievements. And of course, it has weaknesses, and still doesn't have today a verification mechanism, which is one of its major weaknesses. But we need to emphasize the fact that there is a renewed interest in verifying the treaty. During the last review conference, members agreed to create a working group to investigate ways to improve or to reinforce the treaty and improve its implementation, including through a formal verification mechanism based on inspection. And so I would like to focus my remarks on the future and on the future work of this working group. I apologize, I have a bit of a cold, so if my voice is not strong enough, I'll have to stop once in a while. I would like to make two comments about the future work of the working group. One relating to the objectives of future verification mechanisms for the BWC, as the working group is considering different measures. Whatever the measures, it's important to emphasize that those measures should have an objective that is different from the objective of the verification mechanisms for the NPT and the CWC. While the NPT and the CWC verification mechanism aim to prevent and detect potentially illicit activities through monitoring of technologies and material, specialized technologies and material, that's not an objective attainable for the BWC because of the dual-use nature of those technologies and equipment. So we need to find a different objective, and I think one of the objectives of a verification mechanism for the BWC could be to prevent and disrupt future illicit or potentially illicit activities. Because disruption, we've seen it in the past, can be a very powerful tool to prevent a bioweapons program to proceed to make progress. So that should be one. That's an idea that I put out there, and I'm sure we're going to discuss this further. Another remark I would like to make, while the working group's considering ways to improve the BWC, the discussion will certainly focus at some point on the new technologies and how new technologies might improve or facilitate or accelerate the development of biological weapons. And here I would like to highlight the importance of modifying or revising the way the assessment of those technologies is made. Very often, current assessment of new technologies or emerging technologies tend to focus on how the technology might in the future support biological weapons, but that assessment is made in a vacuum. That is, without placing the new technology in the specific context of a bioweapons life cycle. And that's, I think, a major weakness. The second weakness I see in current assessment is that the assessment of new technologies tend to go through a cycle of hype and neglect. When the new technology emerge, there are all kinds of predictions about what in the future it could do to support, accelerate, or facilitate bioweapons programs. But when those predictions do not materialize, the technology is almost neglected. There is no follow-up, there's no revision of the initial assessments. And I think the implementation of the treaty would benefit from a continuous analysis of those technologies as they evolve over time. And as we study them over time, we need to better understand how they are used, what challenges they face, what kind of challenges their users face, and whether new developments affect our assessment of whether they can help or not biological weapons development. So again, I will stop my remark here, but I think it's important to think about the future and the modalities of improving the verification of the treaty.
Thanks very much, Dr. Gormley. I think for the most part, this morning, we're going to be looking at the current status of the treaty and looking forward. But I just wanted to take a moment to reflect, looking back at a really venerable old treaty, and starting with you, Ambassador. What do you see as the most significant achievement of the Biological Weapons Convention?
I'll have to look at some of my notes here. I'm not reading my messages. Okay. Well, first of all, as I said, it's been around for a long time, and we have seen everyone talks about arms control is challenge. What's the future of arms control? And something that we all hear all the time. But I think this is there are successes. This is clearly a success of an arms control treaty that's been around for a long time. We only have a few number of countries who we are concerned about in terms of violations, and I'll go through that very briefly. But we have over 180 countries that are part of this treaty. We have a mechanism by which countries can meet on a regular basis to discuss the challenges that exist. We have been able to think again about what the potential is for a verification regime, something that many of you know that was something that the U.S. was not in favor of for a long time, but we have been able to really get to a point where we can have the question and a discussion about it. Now, of course, geopolitics has again come in and created a problem for having those kind of discussions. But what's important is that we have a mechanism where countries can meet on a regular basis to talk about the BWC and the challenges that exist with the BWC. We have something that has a convention that has set up a norm, international norm against the use and development of biological weapons. Yes, we do have countries and a handful that are still a challenge. And if you read the compliance report from the State Department, we list who those are. But over 180 countries. We cannot let the few overshadow the fact that so many countries continue to adhere to the norm, not just the legal obligation, but the norm against developing these weapons. So it highlights the importance of multilateral efforts, that's being challenged in so many ways today, that we have a mechanism to meet in Geneva on a regular basis and to try to address some of those issues. And recognizing that we do have problems, we'll go through more of the problems, but, I think that all of these things are very, very positive. And as we talk about the countries who are a problem, if you look at the compliance report, there'll be a new one coming out this year, but last year's compliance report, we know we have concerns with China and Iran and North Korea and Russia. Okay, so we know those are the challenge countries that we're dealing with. But that, like I said, there's still a lot of countries that are adhering to the norms. So I think we should recognize that. We should be happy with what we have, and we just have to strengthen it. We have to strengthen it, make sure countries don't leave it, make sure the countries who are in it are abiding by it, and continue to try to strengthen it.
Thank you. Sonia, if I may, can you take that?
I think what another achievement is that this is the first treaty that bans an entire class of weapon systems. So that's an important achievement. And another achievement I think worth emphasizing is the fact that this is not a static treaty. It has evolved over time. Again, in spite of its weaknesses, countries, members have agreed, made decisions that allow them to discuss on a regular basis improvement of the treaty, as Ambassador Jenkins emphasized. So there's a mechanism for discussion. There are other mechanisms to share information and improve transparency, the confidence building measures that have been decided during the, I believe, the second review conference. The creation of the ISU is an important achievement because this is a unit, the implementation unit of support unit of the BWC that allows better coordination, cooperation between countries, sharing of information. That's a major achievement. And of course, there is, again, renewed interest in developing a formal mechanism of verifying the treaty and implementing the treaty. So I think these are achievements worth celebrating.
Thanks. So Ambassador, you mentioned the compliance report, and that's a good segue to my next question. Back in the day in the 90s, as a much younger reporter for Science Magazine, I had the pleasure of visiting the Vector laboratory. And at a time when Russia was trying to commercialize some of its activities and there's a lot more transparency back then. Noting recent coverage in the Washington Post last October about the developments in Russia, quite a worrisome report. I want to ask you to start off with, you mentioned the 4 countries of major concern in the compliance report. Personally, what do you see as the greatest threat to the BWC from state actors these days?
Well, of course, I said, you have these 4 countries who are still doing activities that raises questions in terms of their commitment to the treaty and their compliance with the treaty, particularly Russia, which we have had a continued concern with for many years of what they're trying to do. So obviously the greatest concern is the fact that we still have to try to get these countries to comply with the treaty, or at least we have to feel confident through our intel and everything else that they are complying with the treaty. So that is one of the greatest problems that we have right now. As I said, we still have a lot of countries that are abiding by the treaty, so that's good. And we want to make sure that no additional countries join that list. And that's a continuous thing that these norms and these meetings continue to do. We don't pay much attention to that, but actually these things are ways in which we continue to make sure that the number of countries remains small. But that's a concern. There are other concerns in terms of funding the ISU, countries funding the ISU. That's not a question of developing weapons. That's a question of making sure that the treaty, the ISU can remain viable. But also, even if we were to develop some kind of regime, an inspection regime, it has to be paid for. So the funding aspect and what states do is also a concern. And then, of course, there's still the non-state actor issue. I mean, you mentioned state, but there is still the non-state actor issue, which hasn't gone away. And with these new technologies, you have to concern yourself with, as mentioned earlier, what new capabilities that open up for non-state actors, either with intent to do harm or just non-state actors who just want to develop things just because they can do that. So, these things remain, to me, the top some of the most important things is state actors, getting them to do the right thing, making sure others don't do it. Funding and to keep it viable and to strengthen it. And you're going to need money to do that. And there's not enough, I think, attention to that in terms of countries putting that on a priority. And of course, the work of NACEDT.
Yeah, and I do want to dive a little bit deeper into non-state actors momentarily, but Sonia, what do you see as the greatest threat to the BWC from state actors?
I'm not too worried about state actors developing. Biological weapons are more accessible to states than to terrorist groups. So it's less likely that terrorist groups will be able to develop a working biological weapons. We've seen how complicated that is in the past, for example, with Aung Shinrikyo, who failed at every stage of development of a biological weapon. So if there's a threat, that should be probably a threat from state actors. That said, state actors might not be interested in developing biological weapons because of the difficulty of using those weapons militarily. They are weapons that are very sensitive to the environment, even as a weapon. So they can't be used anytime. Usually, they can't be used during the day because agents can be sensitive to UV light. They are subject to landscape that can affect their dispersion. They are subject to wind conditions, to weather conditions. And of course, they are very difficult to control. So biological weapons can affect a country's own troops and own population. And we've seen through history that biological weapons have never been really included in military doctrines, except perhaps in the Soviet Union. But otherwise, they were not considered as weapons of war because of those logistical and operational problems associated with them. What concerns me the most from state actors is the use of bio-disinformation to weaken the BWC. And we've seen it in recent history with Russia, a Russian campaign of disinformation about US bioactivities, alleging that the assistance programs and cooperation programs that the US has with a variety of countries in the former Soviet Union are actually a cover for bioweapons activities. And they've been repeating these false claims over the years. And most recently, they have used the forum of the BWC to spread those claims by using the tools, the enforcement tools of the BWC via Article 5 and 6. And also recently, in December of last year, Russians have distributed a note verbal, which in fact was a copy of a briefing from a Ministry of Defense official who was repeating the claims about US activities in the former Soviet Union, but also in Africa. So I think my key concern today is the use of biodisinformation to weaken the BWC, to prevent progress during discussions of the working group on developing verification mechanisms.
Certainly appreciate the fact that state actors have challenges deploying some classes of bioweapons. Should note, of course, that the compliance report from State Department and the Defense Department Biodefense Posture Review pointed to development of neurotoxins in China, which may pose a different threat than what you cited. Generally speaking, though, as you say, state actors, there's a lot of inhibition to deploying bioweapons. So naturally, a graver concern could be non-state actors. And in that realm, what do you both see as concerning threats and how to strengthen the BWC to address them, perhaps starting with you, Ambassador.
Well, one of the things that I know that State Department and DoD has traditionally spent a lot of time and money on is on biosecurity and biosafety issues, and making sure that labs are safe and secure around the world, and finding those labs that are not as secure as they could be in areas where there may be groups who may have intent to do something nefarious. So that continues to be of importance. I see it's still important. I'm not sure. I'm not as aware of what's happening now in the administration in terms of these issues. But that has traditionally been something that has been of a lot of concern, is making sure that, we cut off or reduce the possibility of access to a lot of the dual use pathogens, which are so many of them, that can be acquired. And a focus on that, the biosafety, biosecurity, particularly biosecurity piece, is important to helping to ensure that countries and individuals within countries, are actually abiding by the BWC obligations, not to acquire, not to produce, not to do any of those things in terms of biological weapons. So I think that remains important. I think that there is a continuous role for a multilateral entity like the BWC to play a role in that, and to ensure that that does not happen in terms of non-state actors. I know that in the last administration, we had NSM 19, which was to beef up the work that's being done in terms of non-state actors for WMD. So these are things that still remain important. These things we still need to continue to focus on in terms of non-state actors and what they can do. And just to keep the attention to the issue overall is going to be important. As I said, making sure that countries are aware of these threats and making sure that countries are putting this threat higher on their list of priorities is in itself a challenge.
Thanks, Ambassador. Sonia?
Yes, I agree that biosecurity and biosafety improvements and all the programs that the US, European countries have launched since 2001 are important and should be continued. That's essential to prevent access to dangerous pathogens where they exist. Particularly when laboratories are located in areas with a lot of terrorist activity or criminal activity. So these programs are essential. Another possibility of ways to improve or to prevent terrorist development of biological weapons would be to educate scientists very early, because in the life sciences, there are very few scientists who know about the BWC, at least in medical schools, in graduate degrees, there's really no education on biosecurity. There's a lot of focus on bioethics, not so much on biosecurity. And I think that would be important in this context, because that would allow young scientists to not contribute unwittingly to a covert program, whether it is state program or a terrorist program. But when we talk about the terrorist threat of bioweapons, we really need to emphasize that access to bioagent is not sufficient. Bioagents are not a weapon in themselves. They need to be processed. They need to be stabilized. They need to be disseminated. And bioagents are very fragile. They are very difficult to manipulate. And again, they are very sensitive to their environment. So there's a great barrier to bioweapons development generally, and that's the challenge of acquiring the expertise to manipulate those agents so they maintain their lethal characteristics throughout their development, through all stages of development. And these are conditions that are difficult to meet for terrorist groups. I think they are more accessible to states, but here again, we saw from past bioweapons programs that that's still very complicated for states. So I think we need to bring out this message that dissuasive message that biological weapons are extremely difficult to produce and make them less, that would make them less attractive to states or terrorist groups.
Just wanted to, thanks for that. Just want to add one other thing is, as we talk about awareness, one of the things that I thought was really helpful when we launched the Global Security Agenda a few years back, is we were able to bring into a larger conversation the issues of biosecurity and biosafety. So when we looked at, infectious diseases that can happen, whether it's natural, accidental, or intentional, what it was able to do is bring it to a larger discussions of individuals who may not be really focusing on the intentional side as much, and raise awareness to the whole issue. And I thought that was very helpful in terms of, we talk about education, just talking about the awareness aspect, but also talking about, ways in which different parts of organizations can work together on addressing some of these issues. And so that I felt was really helpful in that way. And I think, there's still work that's being done to try to, bring a wider awareness of the issue of biosecurity and biosafety and its role in this larger effort to try to address infectious disease threats and build the capacity of countries to really address these issues.
Thanks. I thought we might spend the balance of our time in this first session really drilling down a bit on strengthening the BWC going forward. As in my recent work for Science Magazine, I focused a lot on China, and I have to admit it's very hard to differentiate biodefense, legitimate biodefense research from potential bioweapons research, delving into the military and medical research there. And there's a lot of papers out there in the scientific literature that are actually rather important contributions. So I would like to know from the two of you, obviously it's a lot easier to hide illicit BW activities in a nuclear weapons program. How can the BWC be strengthened to differentiate bioweapons research from biodefense research?
I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to answer that too much. I'll leave it to the scientists who can really get into the nitty-gritty of that. And how to do that. But I think you raised the question once again of, we've talked a lot about, inspections and, you have to have a mechanism to do these. You have to have countries who want to help the international community to be able to be better at making these distinctions and doing that. If you have countries who are happy with the difficulty of doing that, even for scientists to do that, that's one of the challenges we have with the BWC overall, is the lack of attention by countries, the lack of willingness to really abide by obligations, particularly by those particular countries, which casts a shadow on all of it. And being able to use whatever mechanisms or technology that exists, if there is any, to really do some of these things. So for me, just looking at that question without a scientific background, it really is about the willingness of countries to help promote what needs to be done to strengthen the BWC and to make countries more confident that individual countries are doing what they should be doing under the articles of the convention to make sure that they're living up to their obligations. And if there's issues like this in terms of inability to make these distinctions, then countries need to step up to try to figure out how we can make it better, and how we can fix it. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that. And I think we also have to acknowledge that, there has to be countries showing their respect for these issues and respect for not just for science, but the respect for how we need to be able to determine some of these things within science. And until we have that, I think there are a lot of these questions are going to remain and not be really fulfilled.
So knowing, Sonia, that there are going to be countries that are not going to step up in this way, what would be some of your recommendations on strengthening the BWC to address that distinction between biodefense and bioweapons research?
Right. So it's very complicated, difficult to differentiate between illicit and illicit activity. So I don't think we really can, because there's no specific technology, there's no specific activity that could signal a bioweapons program. And we've seen that again through history. The Soviets have been quite successful at hiding bioweapons activities behind apparently legitimate research. So trying to differentiate licit and illicit activities can be complicated. That's why I think it would be best to focus on disruptions. And disruptions, as I said earlier, is really a powerful tool in preventing a bioweapons program to proceed. And we've seen it again through history. Every time there was a disruption in a bioweapons program, whether it was a state program or a terrorist program. And when I talk about disruption, I mean inspection, or even a threat of inspection or a threat of police activity. The countries or terrorist groups stopped their activities. They stopped it. They destroyed documents. They destroyed material, sometimes technologies, or moved technologies elsewhere, and ended and stopped, at least temporarily, their work. And that's very important when we consider the fragility of bioagents. When we introduce changes in their environment, they can die, they can be destroyed. And just the fact that a country or a terrorist group destroys material, a batch that they may have produced to avoid detection, that's already a great achievement of potential inspection. So disruptions are extremely important, and we need to build that in the new or future verification mechanism for the BWC, that is exploiting that vulnerability of living microorganisms that are used in bioweapons development. So disruptions can happen through verifications, formal verifications, even if they don't detect or catch the perpetrators red-handed. Just the disruption itself will have a positive effect on preventing the program from progressing. We can achieve, or we can improve our understanding of what countries do by promoting exchanges and cooperation. And in fact, if we think about improving exchanges, scientific exchanges and cooperation, that could be built also in the future verification mechanism for the treaty. That is, countries that receive support through cooperation under Article 10 could agree on verification or inspections of their work or peer review of their work. So that could be a beneficial way to both deal with improvement of the verification of the treaty, but also on keeping an eye on what countries do and ensuring that this cooperation is not being used for illicit purposes. And when we consider whether countries are using expertise that they have acquired through cooperation, I think we also need to look at the whole ecosystem of science in that specific country and look at the culture, look at the scientific culture in the country, think about how decisions are made at the scientific level, because all this can impact how science can be applied for specific purposes, and particularly bioweapons. So I think we should have a broader view of a country's scientific activities and culture, organization, management, in order to really appreciate how they can use science for bioweapons purposes.
Just wanted to add one thing is we have to make sure that we also speak to all the pharmaceutical companies and get them on board with a lot of this. I mean, there's a lot of, we're dealing with, obviously, we all know it's a dual use nature of all of these things. It makes it very challenging, which is a basic fact about the whole regime. But we also have to bring in the conversation, you know, all the experts, all the scientists to see what's possible. I'm one of those people that always see the glass half full and always, despite the dual use nature of this, I still think that maybe there's something that could be done that could strengthen this effort. You know, whether it's through, you know, increased confidence building measures or some kind of verification regime that's just like not nearly like the CWC, but something that can take account of the fact that there's so many labs around the world. How do you deal with that? There's a lot of real issues. But, you know, we if there's a will to try to do something, as we saw in the CWC with the Chemical Manufacturers Association, something, if we could get the pharmaceutical companies to be on board with this, but we know why they're not. We understand why they're challenged by this issue. But we have to recognize that they also play a role in this. So in anything we do, we'll have to involve them.
We have a lot of expertise in the room and online. So we're going to shortly open it up to questions. Please have a question ready, I hope. But before we do, just one last question I'll pose to the panelists myself. And I'd like to compare the Secretariat of the BWC to the Secretariats of that implement the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons in the CWC. It's kind of tiny and poorly resourced. Is it time, do you think, for signatories to invest serious resources in the Secretariat? And if so, do you believe there's the political will to do so?
Yes and no. I think that there certainly is. I mean, yeah, there's the ISU compared to the IAEA and the OPCW. There is no comparison. You know, first of all, I just want to say thank you to the ISU for what they do with what they have in terms of the small staff and not nearly the funding, obviously, that the other two get. So just want to first of all just thank them for what they do in light of what they have and what they have to work with. However, it's obvious, and you know, the funding is, I mentioned that briefly, that's a huge issue, and it doesn't get the attention that it needs to get. The BWC, the issue of biological weapons, compared to the other two, and probably if you had a bigger entity, you may get more attention because countries would have to be putting more money into it for it to exist. And that, I think, if you're putting more money into something, you're naturally going to pay more attention to it. If you think it can have something without putting the money in, why not? Even if we're talking about science and technology efforts, you know, trying to make sure that all countries of the BWC get access to new science technology, is there a desire to put money into making that happen? No. So, you know, the bottom line, you can't do things without money. And so there has to be a political will to do it. There has to be a financial desire to put money into to growing something that will continue to help implement the BWC as it should be implemented, in light of what we already know in terms of the challenges that we have and the fact that we know there's going to be more diseases. Hopefully we won't have individuals, you know, violating the BWC. But it's what we know can happen in the future, and then we see what we have. Obviously, they say the math is not mathing. So yes, we need more, and no, the political will is not there, and that's something we have to really work on.
Would you like to add to that, Sonia?
I completely agree. The challenge will be the funding. Currently, the BWC, the ISU do not have a dedicated funding budget. They are funded through the UN, general budget of the UN. So whatever happens at the UN level will affect the BWC and the ISU. So it will depend on the future if a verification mechanism, a formal verification mechanism is agreed upon and an organization is created, whether to implement the treaty, whether it is based on the ISU or a different organization, then the key challenge will be where to find the funds and what countries are going to be willing to do, how much more funding are they willing to provide to support that effort?
We have just about 15 minutes. I would like to open up to questions now. If you could please tell us your name and affiliation.
Hi, Jerry Epstein. I retired from the federal government recently, so I guess the organization that I'm not speaking for now is the RAND Corporation. Dr. Gormley, I was really intrigued by your opening statement that the BWC cannot be verified in the same way that other treaties can. And I think building on that could absolutely transform this debate and make something useful come out of this. It's always been frustrating to me looking at discussions of verification in the past that has been blamed on lack of political will or the power of the industry when there are significant scientific, technological, economic differences between biology and the other regimes that make it impossible to have a verification regime like we have. So I was really, really gladdened to hear you say that. And I think that's a very promising area to pursue. I guess I want to go a little bit further there. In the earlier discussions of dual-use research of concern and governance of life science, when the security community and the scientific community first started talking to each other, I was always worried about the imposition of what I labeled LPS, let's pretend security, measures that would be imposed on science that might actually impede it, but didn't really add anything to that. I think at this point, I now might be concerned about LPV, let's pretend verification. There's a lot of things we can imagine making companies and countries do that won't add any assurance to anybody, but could actually be quite disturbing and damaging. And even your point on disruption, which I again think is very intriguing. If we have a mechanism whose job is to disrupt something, you certainly like to disrupt the weapons program. But if you apply that at any legitimate facility, it's hard to see people are really going to want to sign up for destroying, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of seed stock or whatever. Maybe that's a price we pay for an effective regime if it's an effective. But I worry that I worry that might actually be turned around in some way that might not be useful. I guess my bottom line question is how likely do you think it is that we can start from your starting point and saying we're not going to verify this like we did, but we're still looking for something useful. In fact, maybe I'm admitting my ignorance. I think the name of the working group that's talking about this is Working Group for Measures for Strengthening the Implementation of the Convention. I don't think it says verification. And that's a very promising line. If we can come up with measures that strengthen the implementation, that's great. But if we have to hang them on the V word, that might be actually kind of concerning. And I don't know how locked we are into 1980s discussions and terminology when we're now at 2025. Sorry, and one last point, Ambassador Jenkins, it was totally appropriate to bring up the role of the pharmaceutical industry. They're clearly a major player. But in the 1970s and 80s, they were maybe the only major player. Now we're going into a world of multi-trillion-dollar bioeconomy. We have a huge range of industrial and commercial players that might be affected by this. And so it is critically important to get buy-in and get awareness of that wider group. But I think it's a much broader set than just the pharmaceutical companies. Thank you.
My question is so related to Jerry's that if I could just add on, which is.
But you got to introduce yourself first.
Oh, Nancy Connell.
Not that anybody here needs that, but.
Thank you. Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, and I'm also a member of the Committee on International Security and Arms Control here at the NAS. So my question was actually looking forward and backwards. And there were 20, 30 years when you would be hauled off the stage for using the verification word. Happened to me. So, and so my question then is why, what are the geopolitical and economic differences now that we can go back and visit this again? And just one, as Jerry will do, I'll add a final comment, which is that those of us who work in the select agent programs are constantly challenged with inspections. So, I'm visiting old ground here, but CDC will walk in giving us, literally a 2-hour notice So we, I just wanted to add those 2 points to the discussion and not come around again.
Do you want to start off, Sonia, responding?
Sure. Jerry, I think it's a fair point. I based my comment about disruption based on what we know so far about covered bioweapons programs. So covered bioweapons programs want to remain covered and prevent detection. And when there's a threat of inspections, or in the case of Aum-Shinrikyo, a threat of police activity, they all had the same attitude, that is closing, shutting down their activities, destroying material, etc. And I think that's an important way to either verify or improve implementation of the treaty, because again, that takes into account the vulnerability of the main material that is used in bioweapons, which are microorganisms. And disrupting them doesn't mean that they can't restart their activities later on or somewhere else. But that can delay the program. Just an example, in the former US bioweapons program, when I interviewed, I did an oral history of the former US and former Soviet bioweapons program, and I interviewed a variety of scientists. The American scientists told me that every time they stopped production at the production plant, the pilot production plant at Fort Detrick, to clean up the facility in order to start a different production. They had about 2 or 3 weeks of work where they couldn't produce anything viable. The batch was always contaminated, and they weren't sure whether that was due to the fact that the facility was not cleaned up properly, or because after 2 or 3 weeks, the new team that came in to produce a new agent did things differently, and suddenly that solved the problems that they faced. So that indicates that, again, changing the environment of bioagents have an impact on the actual production. And I think I would like to emphasize what Nancy said too, is the fact that, and Ambassador Jenkins, that if we involve the pharmaceutical industry, but also all the different branches of biotech today, there could be a way to identify verifications or inspections that would not disturb their work, or minimally, but still achieve disruption. And just as a side note, the BWC protocol of 2001 could have achieved that, because the BWC protocol included prior notice for inspections or visits of 7 or 14 days. And that would have given ample time for a covered program to clean up, move, etc., or for legitimate facilities to protect their information, etc. But at the same time, the disruption to the covered program would have been effective, because it would have led the program to again move their activities, destroy material, destroy technologies, or move them elsewhere. And we also need to remember that there are stages of development in the bioweapons that are much more vulnerable to disruptions than others. One of them is when a program is just starting, and the teams are learning about the agents they're working on. They're creating new knowledge. If a disruption happened during that period, that will delay their knowledge accumulation phase. And sometimes if disruptions are repeated, then that will prevent it from progressing at all. And another vulnerable phase is the production phase, which is a vulnerable phase because, again, agents, when they are produced or scaled up, they are subject to changes in their environment, which can cause contamination. And this is a problem in bioweapons development, but also in the pharmaceutical industry. Scale-up always causes challenges with contamination. So just to wrap up here, I think disruptions can be important. They can be part of a verification mechanism. But of course, if we involve all the branches of pharmaceutical industry, biotech industry, we can develop a mechanism that can be efficient for the BWC, as it was efficient, as sure as you know, when the CWC was developed, different associations of chemical industry contributed to the negotiation and development of a verification mechanism that made sense for the CWC, but also that didn't disturb too much chemical facilities.
Just briefly, because I see we have some more folks. Yes, we have not been using the word verification in Geneva for obvious reasons. And the thing that really did change is in terms of between 2001 and now is a decision really in the US that we wanted to see what is possible. We didn't say we were definitely going to have verification. We just wanted to open up the door from where we had been for so long to see what might be possible in terms of mechanisms. And also having been hammered for so many years by the Russians and the PRC on this issue, we just wanted to open up the door to see what is possible in this space. And I agree, Jerry. I think that, and one of the goals was, let's see what is possible. What can we do in terms of increased exchanges? Not necessarily what was there for the CWC for obvious reasons, but what is possible. And yes, we do need to invite all of the players. And as technology changes and grows, that desk and that table may need to grow to involve other entities that would make whatever mechanism is decided one that would actually work.
Well, certainly if there's an opportunity to disrupt any of the 4 nations you mentioned in the compliance report, I'll sign up for that mission as a journalist. We have 2 people ready to pose questions in the room. Let's take them both at the same time and see if we can address them before the break.
Thanks. I'm Chris Park. 2 things. The first is I wanted to pull the thread of Sonia's idea of disruption a little bit, particularly in the context of Jerry's concern about, verification as performance art and the potential impact of measures on industry and others. As I take it, when you're talking about disruption, because there are a variety of forms of disruption, from interdicting supply to, let's say, a robust kinetic version of on-site inspection. But in between those is holding at risk the political consequences of exposure of a program, right? We're going to be able to go somewhere and we will be sufficiently intrusive that we might find something. Even if you think it's a low probability, you're going to be defensive and protective, so you're going to take steps to clean it up. And that is going to add political risk to your calculus. It's going to add time. It's going to add cost to your budget. And all of those things are going to tend to help keep, a wet blanket over programs. That's what I think I'm drawing from your concept. And I like that. And it certainly does make sense in the context of, for example, the protocol, where the word verification never occurred. And inspection is a word that only occurred in the context of challenge inspections. The challenge is, how do you measure or judge your ability to actually have that impact in order to avoid putting in place a system that is purely performative? Because it's not as cut and dry as sort of a verification indicator. So I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts about that. But the one other comment I want to make really quickly is at the 50th anniversary, it's time to think about this. Ambassador Leonard died in 2000 at 100 years old. Don Maley, our negotiator for the protocol, has passed on. Mike Moody, who was the head of the U.S. delegation for the third RevCon, has passed on quite recently, just last year. But we've gotten this room, for example, Bob Mikulak, who, while he was on vacation, decided to detour and show up for the signing ceremony in London for the BWC. We've got Jerry, who was project director for OTA's project on the technologies underlying weapons of mass destruction in the early 90s. If I'm not mistaken, Mike Guin, who was the NSC lead for a lot of this stuff under Kissinger, is still with us. There are still people out there, but the number is shrinking. And it's time, I think, really for people to start thinking about who might be able to put together a series of interviews and an oral history, ideally talking to people from more than one country. But a lot of these issues have long histories and have been debated in circles, and it would be really useful to pick some of those brains or pickle them, either one. Thank you.
To continue with pulling on threads that Chris started. My name is Lyubcha Gerginsky, or Jivan for some. I'm currently the facilitator still on science and technology in Geneva, so perhaps I'll end there, where what's going on right now, perhaps, you know, the what is possible idea, where we are at Geneva. But let's start like really broadly from where you started, which is, you know, celebrating 50 years, as you said, Ambassador. It's worth celebrating because no bioweapons attack has occurred in these 50 years that we know of internationally. We have the Sverdlovsk situation, which was an internal one. It did uncover a bioweapons program 4 years after the coming into force of the convention, and it was proven 14 years after that, but internally still. Internally in the US with the Rajneeshi, but really internationally, the convention has stood its ground because of that logic that you mentioned, because bioweapons have very little military value. Now people say, well, the sciences are changing, maybe that's going to change. But let's think how that is. And I would start with the fact that let's just put the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, not broader, though we can go broader as well. If those 5 agree that, listen, we have a lot of other tools for war and violence, why don't we put this aside? It's not useful as a military weapon. It creates a lot of ambiguity. That means as well not provoking and perhaps, you know, restraining oneself from things that might provoke others. Because if you put an Aegis Ashore missile system in Poland or Romania, the other side might not like it, but they'll be able to calculate. These are cruise missiles. They have this kind of speed. They can go in the air ballistic. They can see all of those things. With the lab, it's different. So it just creates a lot of ambiguity that is unnecessary. So if there is an agreement around the norm, which goes back in the convention itself, repugnant to the conscience of mankind, goes back to the Geneva Protocols, goes back to years. The norm is a strong one because of that feeling of it being repugnant in military affairs as well. And if the 5 countries say, listen, we don't want to use this, who else is going to use them? What other state actor? I'm very convinced that I can say that in the next 200 to 500 years, if the structure of the international system remains as such, if the main players say we're not using this, no other state actor is going to use them. Then, okay, non-state actors, bioterrorists. You, as you said, Ambassador, you limit the access, you limit the knowledge, you limit those, and then you have international police, Interpol, all these other services. So it's really simple, actually, to do it. So to come back to that thread of let's see what is possible. What is possible right now is that in terms of science and technology, we had a very, very mature product. Terms of reference was a procedure, it was adopted. It wasn't because other measures weren't, international cooperation and assistance, for instance. We're there with that as well right now. So the chair of the working group, Ambassador Mayer, has said, well, let's now put verification as well, compliance verification, onto this bandwagon. Started off with science and technology, onto which international cooperation and assistance has been latched on. And now we have as well compliance and verification. So with gratitude from international actors who are viewing this from the outside in the US, to you, Ambassador, and to the US, to have restarted this and to have said, let's see what is possible, it's happening right now. It's happening in a complicated environment. We're going to need to see how we do it, but it's happening. So again, from that international perspective, looking into the US, if that is now withdrawn, it might be viewed as irresponsible, to say the least, and certainly not go into a direction where verification needs to go. So we are at a nexus. We need to take that opportunity, and hopefully we can. But if not, it can be really detrimental on the convention. Thanks.
Well, thank you. We are certainly out of compliance on time, but I don't think Vita and Tricia are too exercised. I'll ask 60-second responses and closing comments all wrapped up into one. You want?
Yeah, I'll start because my throat's dry. Congratulations, Chris. Didn't know you're departing. Lots of wonderful years of your hard work. I love the idea of our history. And, you know, you mentioned Bob Mikulak, who I've also known for many years, and others around here who've been really dedicated to the issue of biological weapons. And some of the experts who are young and old who've been doing this. I think it'd be great, you know, to kind of put that down in history. I was thinking that with the Chemical Weapons Convention and the destruction of all the declared chemical weapons by the US should be in all history. So I agree with that. Sorry. And on the idea of having the 5 say not use, I think it's more of a reaffirmation of the commitments already made with the BWC. I think that would be fine if they could reaffirm that, yes, we are parties to the BWC. Thank you. Well, parties to the BWC, we're going to abide by all the articles of the BWC and hopefully not see them in future compliance reports. And yes, that could hopefully be something that would create a situation where others would not want to violate the CWC and also that BWC. But it would be great to have a reaffirmation of commitments. You know, I mean, after 50 years, you know, that would be nice to have reaffirmation by countries. Unfortunately, as we know, they know they're parties to this treaty. They know they're obligated to the treaty. They know they have an international obligation to abide by all the articles. And unfortunately, they're not doing that. But that's why we have to keep working on them to actually do what they're supposed to do under the treaty that they willingly agreed to do when they ratified the treaty. And if we could do it via the 5 countries working together to do a reaffirmation, that's great. But I agree that's something that we need to keep doing, and that could serve as a model, of course, for others to also not do a violation.
Sonia?
Right. Thank you for the question about how can we measure the effectiveness of disruption? And I wish I had an answer today. I think it's something that I still need to reflect on. But I think if scientific work, the major features of scientific work do not change, I think we know that disruption is effective because specifically in the bioweapons program, but in any scientific project, to make progress, teams need continuity and stability of work. And if you disrupt that continuity and stability of work, the knowledge accumulation is disrupted, production is disrupted, etc. So if unless something fundamentally changes in the way scientific work is conducted, then we know, again, from past examples, that disruption of this stability and continuity of work can effectively prevent progress and or delay a program. But one way to verify that disruptions can be effective is to have exercises, for example, with the pharmaceutical industry, and disrupt their work and see how that affects the development, their scientific research, or their production.
I'll say one last thing, and I know we have to finish. I always thought that, you know, and those of you who are scientists know much more than I do. In terms of using the word verification or inspection, we don't use that, we use mechanisms. But, I always thought it'd be, if we approach it, not so much thinking about what do we do in the CWC? What do we do in the NPT context? One of the things I think was problem was looking at verification of the BWC after we had agreed to the verification of the CWC. And I think that spooked a lot of folks, and particularly the pharmaceutical industry and others when they saw that as a kind of a foundation. But to approach it from just from a new perspective and just say, let's not think about the CWC and what we did in that situation. And, a lot of this has already gone on, but, as a non-scientist, just, pulling back and starting a conversation about, just looking at the dual use and everything that's different about the BWC, and starting from that conversation with all of the experts, the pharmaceuticals, everyone, and not using that as a past inspections as the North Star, just kind of like starting over and just say what's unique, what is so unique about this environment and what we're trying to do, and is it ever going to be possible? And these are good questions about, we don't want to do something that's actually not going to do anything. It's going to make it look like we're doing something. But what is really possible? And just starting from there. And I know a lot of, not to say this hasn't happened, because I know a lot of people around the room has worked on these things for years. But I always say we keep thinking about the CWC, and I don't think that's necessarily always going to be the best way to approach this. So
I think we're going to take a short break now. How many minutes? 5-minute break. Run out, get coffee and snacks. First, though, I would like to thank our wonderful panelists this morning.
Thank you.
Our next session. So if our next set of panelists could join us up at the front, and I'm going to introduce our next moderator. Let's see. Okay, great. So our next panel will be moderated by Jennifer Mackbee. Jennifer is a non-resident executive fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. She's very well suited to moderate this next session because she's worked on non-proliferation and international security issues for many years now, and has directed more recently a project with FAS on a BWC scientific and technical advisory body, and then worked on the second phase of that project with NAS. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. I think a lot of people are still outside, but thank you also to National Academies, of course, for putting on this event. The panel is called the Conclave, and it is, when we hear the word conclave, we think of a private gathering of cardinals locked up until they select the next pope. Conclave means with key, as we probably know. So we are here in an unlocked meeting room being viewed by people in this open space and online, although our task might be more difficult than picking the Pope. So let's see if we can generate some smoke here. My name is Jennifer Mackbee, and I've worked on the BWC Secretariat in Geneva. I've written about meetings of BWC. I directed a project at CSIS on bioterrorism among Europeans and Russians, and a project as Tricia just mentioned, at FAS, as well as here at for the NAS Inter-Academy Partnership. And this was included a proof of concept or simulation modeled on the S&T advisory mechanism that states parties are considering in their meetings in Geneva. The simulation addressed the potential impact of artificial intelligence on global biosecurity. And the meeting was held in Trieste and included about 40 key scientists from more than 30 countries from all 5 UN regional groups, including US, Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. So I'm mentioning this because of the increasing influence of AI in bio, and to note that indeed NGOs can contribute to multilateral agreements. So the 1925 Geneva Protocol prevented the use of biological weapons. And the BWC of 1975 encompasses the prohibition of their development, production, stockpile, acquisition, and retention. It is thus called the first treaty to ban an entire class of weapons. which was noted previously. With the 188 states parties and 4 signatories, BWC has played an important role in preventing the use of biological weapons. Now the dramatic new advances in biotech, gene editing, AI, and the rapid exchange of information can continue to enormous progress in health, medicine, agriculture, fuel, economy, and so forth. However, these advances could be used to develop new, potentially more deadly forms of biological weapons, posing possible proliferation and security risks. To that end, the BWC states parties have been considering the establishment of a scientific and technical advisory mechanism for many years. Such a mechanism can help states, especially those with limited resources, to develop informed national policy, assist in fulfilling their BWC obligations, prevent the misuse of biological weapons, and would also be useful in promoting international cooperation and exchange of knowledge, which isn't been very much considered in Geneva. It would also help build confidence in the BWC process and enhance its authority as an international instrument. And I'm pleased to see that Yupcho is in the room because he's been dealing with this for many years. I'll let the panelists address the many other issues facing the states parties, including increasing numbers of BSL 3 and 4 high containment labs, issues relating to compliance and possible verification protocol, maybe even the UN Secretary General's monitoring mechanism. But for this important, I'm very pleased to be joined by a stellar panel of key experts who've been working for years on BWC and other scientific issues. Each panelist will provide reflections on the issues in the program, and they will speak for 3 to 5 minutes each. I've been instructed to keep to the time limits, so I will do that. We will discuss these issues and then, of course, welcome questions. So I'll introduce the panelists here. Since you have their bios, I'll just note their names and current affiliations. Nancy Connell is a senior scholar at the National Academies. Dave Stiefel is Director of Global Biological Policy and Programs at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Gigi Gronwall is a professor in the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering and senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. John Moulton is Deputy Director and Senior Fellow at the Jan Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons at the Council on Strategic Risks. And Daniel Correa is the Chief Executive Officer of the Federation of American Scientists. I'd just like to note that my organization, the Geneva Center for Security Policy, is active in the field. It's held training sessions about arms control and nonproliferation in various regions, including in the Middle East, where I've spoken about the BWC. And my colleague Simon Cleoberry is conducting a series of workshops about verification and compliance in Geneva, in Mexico City for the GRULOC, in Manila for ASEAN countries, and Addis Ababa for the African group. Another colleague, Kathleen Luan, is moderating a panel of the BWC commemorating event that's taking place right now in Geneva as we speak here. And she and I coordinated to ask our panelists on both sides of the Atlantic, what are the 3 key action points that states parties could take going forward? So fair warning, I look forward to your answers. And Nancy, please, over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks to the previous panel and the wide-ranging discussion that set the stage for the rest of the morning. I spent the weekend with UNODA's wonderful collection of all of the documents from the very opening of the BWC, and it was an experience. No, I didn't read 80,000 pages, but if you go back to the earliest collections, the first, second, third review conferences, and review the summaries, and for this discussion, the list of attendees, what I'd like to do is continue the theme or the thread of celebration of the BWC by reviewing who was there when. And one of the successes that I would maintain of the BWC is the enormous engagement of the scientific community and the NGOs, such as those represented here, that I think we lose track of. You know, many of us go to the BWC and everybody's there, Well, they weren't there in the beginning, and they have now started coming. And for example, in the second review conference, the first review conference doesn't have too much to read, frankly, and it's all kind of Xerox copies and mimeographs and so scanned mimeographs. But in 1986, the Swedes presented a paper where they discussed cloning, they discussed immunology. They talked about putting two pieces of DNA together. This was a big deal. Neuroweapons, immunology, understanding pathogenesis, the creation of recombinant agents, and robotics. Robotics was discussed in 1986. So, there's nothing new under the sun, is my point. And the way that the BWC was framed, and we all know this, was so clever that anything that has developed has come forward. So at the end of that discussion in 1986, the Swedes say the convention thus covers all recent advancements in science and technology for weapons purposes. In view of the accelerating development in genetics and biotech, 1986, the Swedish government considers it highly important that the operation of the convention is periodically reviewed in order to assure that the purpose of the preamble and the provisions of the conventions are being realized. And hence we have these wonderful review conferences now every year that many scientists attend. So the next year, 1991, we had a number of NGOs, the Biotechnology Industry Coalition. Early on, industry was there. The Institute for Molecular Biology in Berlin, the Council for Responsible Genetics, at which a pledge was presented, signed by 1,000 scientists from around the world, pre-email, right? Those pledges, those signatures were gathered, pledging never to engage in the conduct of research that would knowingly lead to the development of a biological weapon. The Federation of American Scientists was there early on. The Friends World Committee, the Quakers were there, of course. The CIPRI was there, and the Women's International League. In the next year, we see, again, more people coming. The American Society for Microbiology, the British Medical Association. FAS now has a working group on biological weapons verification, as we began to discuss in the first panel. Friends came back, of course, International Physicians to Prevent Nuclear War, the International Network of Engineers and Scientists for Global Responsibility. We all remember Catherine Nixdorf and Erhard Geisler and Iris Hunger and all of these wonderful people. By now, Alexander Kella, and by now, Joe Husbands is attending, although the NAS is not listed as an NGO. I'm not sure why. Look into that. And Pugwash. Pugwash showed up in 91 for the first time. Skip ahead to the fifth review conference. Now from a single page at the end of the list of attendees, from a single page, we're now around 3 or 4 pages. The Center for Conflict Resolution, I'm just adding the new ones, Harvard Sussex, from where we derive many of the the folks who run the ISU now. A couple of Japanese groups. Ed Hammond from the Sunshine Project was present. The University of Bradford with Graham Pearson and Malcolm Dando and Simon Whitby and all of these wonderful scientists who were have totally been engaged. And then finally in 2006, and that's where I'll stop this review, there are 8 pages of NGOs. So and in fact, there are almost more NGOs, people attending as NGOs than the delegations. That being said, the delegations were starting to get pretty big. So I would argue then that one of the real accomplishments of the BWC is the integration of scientists into the work. This sort of arc of concern that Dr. Gormley talked about. She mentioned that there are a new technology comes, there's a cycle of panic and neglect. So cloning, oh my God, that's okay. PCR, oh my God, it's okay now. CRISPR, we're all calm with CRISPR now, right? We're okay about CRISPR, and we're panicking about AI. We'll calm down about AI too, I predict. So this cycle, we need to pay attention to, and I agree with Dr. Gormley that following through what happened with those issues, and then finally, all of these techniques have added to our understanding of pathogenicity, of immunology, of transmissibility, and indirectly to the issue of stability, weaponization, and the two issues there, stability and dissemination, which I think get short shrift from among the scientific community. We don't pay enough attention to those issues. And I will stop there, just, throwing out my initial comments. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. That was quite a good look back at history. Gigi.
Thank you. So I wanted to start with talking a little bit about how important the BWC is. It's really hard to imagine now, but there was a time before the BWC when U.S. People in national security who had put in a lot of resources into what was one of the biggest biological weapons programs on the planet, and had committed a lot of resources to it, decided to unilaterally walk away from that and start in motion the process of forming the Biological Weapons Convention. They had the strategic foresight to be able to do that, to know that that would make the U.S. more safe and make Americans safer, make the world safer. And it ushered in the peaceful use of biotechnology and led to the U.S., and many other countries as well, but it directly led to the U.S. having incredible leadership in biotechnology, which of course we are in the process of rapidly dismantling, but it is still the case that the U.S. is a major leader in this, and we can tie that to the foresight of the people who decided to use biology for peaceful purposes. The BWC doesn't get a lot of we talked about the resources that they should get, but they do not. But it's really important to accentuate the positive here. I mean, the BWC there is no nation, as opposed to the nuclear world, there is no nation that brags about its biological weapons program. They, in fact, even the known clear violators of the BWC, which have had past clear evidence of violations of the BWC, like Russia, that they have rewritten history to have no longer ever had a biological weapons program, showing the power of this norm that the BWC encompasses. But there's work to do, and I want to highlight just a few things that we're doing in our program to address this. First, the work of our amazing graduate student, Annie Sundelson, who just published a paper, it's open access in politics and life sciences, describing Russia's disinformation campaign and how that has cost literal money and a lot of time, and how it has been disruptive to the BWC. And so this is a force that the rest of us need to deal with. I encourage you to read that paper. And it means that the NGOs and other organizations need to step up and help to bring cohesiveness to the states parties that are trying to make progress on dealing with biological weapons threats. So we have done some projects led by Matt Shearer, and including Christine Potter, Rachel Vahey, and Alana Fogarty, to basically try and be a little bit of this glue for the BWC to understand what different delegations are thinking and how we can make progress on confidence building measures, on international cooperation and assistance, and also what we don't use the V word, we talk about assurance, and how we could be assured that the convention is being adhered to. So I urge, we would love to continue this work. I think it's needed more than ever. And I hope to learn from other NGOs and some of the progress they're making to be this glue to keep the BWC progress going.
Well, thank you so much, Gigi. I mean, it is often that the other superpower is blamed for everything at the BWC, so I'm glad there'll be something to counteract that. Thank you. Dave.
Great, thanks. And thanks to the National Academies for hosting us today. I want to start by saying nothing that I'm going to say is going to be new. or unique or something that blows everybody's mind, because these conversations have been going on for 50 years. And I doubt that me, an almost 40-year-old, is going to sit here and come up with something that is so novel that every person in this room, including multiple ambassadors, has never thought of it before. But as one of my former recent bosses used to say, if we can all just start with a basic set of facts and agree on the facts, then we can move forward. And I think a lot of time in these discussions, we don't talk about some of the elephants in the room. We hint at it, but we don't just blatantly say it. So I do think that we should be celebrating the BWC on the 50th anniversary. And the BWC has done really good things, factually, right? There are 188 signatories or states parties and 4 more signatory states. That's amazing. It was the first convention to prohibit a weapon of mass destruction. That is a great thing. According to Seth Karras, it's led to more than 20 offensive biological programs being dismantled. That is a great thing. You can fit the convention on a single sheet of paper. In some ways, that is a great thing. In some ways, that's not, but also a fact. It's very small. It is funded about 1/50th of the CWC, right? The OPCW. It's funded about 1/50th of the OPCW. That is a fact. That is difficult. And as Jerry pointed out earlier, we talk a lot about verification, but nobody agrees on whether verification is actually possible. Many people say it isn't, but what verification is a very politically charged word right now. Over 20 years ago, there was a study, VERX, to see what could be possible in terms of verification and strengthening, and it has left a very dark shadow for the last 20 years. Geopolitically, it is very hard to reach consensus in any multilateral forum, especially in this day and age, probably even a little bit harder. And there are budgetary constraints, and a lot of people have hinted at historically and will continue to hint at amazing swings, creating a massive OPCW-like organization, which I think is a really great idea in some way, or having major shifts to the treaty. But right now, geopolitically, that might not be possible, and we are living in a time of resource constraints. So, is there still hope? And I think the answer is yes. So, we have seen after the 9th RevCon that there is a geopolitical opening to start talking about strengthening the convention, including approaches that can help strengthen the convention. So, enter NTI. Since we're supposed to talk about what the NGOs are doing, we saw a political opening and decided we would look for measures and bring experts together to figure out ways and approaches to enhance transparency in the BWC and bioscience writ large. I want to be clear from the beginning, we are not trying to do VERX 2.0. What we're trying to do is put together a list of approaches that have been informed by both science and technical experts, as well as diplomats, that could lead to potential adoption or at least drastic changes in lowering the misperceptions of bioscience research. Understanding that consensus is quite hard in this day and age, we framed our conversation around 2 key areas. The status quo has worked, but it could be better. And capital V verification is a term we should probably not try to achieve at this moment because that brings in other complexities. So we challenged the experts that we talked to with what approaches could be useful now and in the future that get us a step further than status quo, but we avoid the complexities of capital V verification. What we're hoping to provide is a look that says VERX gave us really, really interesting examples, 21 interesting examples of way to strengthen the BWC. Science and technology has advanced, tools have advanced. Maybe some of these items that were in VERX are more useful now or less useful now than they used to be. But also in an age of lack of consensus and the ability to not achieve consensus, can we put forward approaches that are informed, that could be taken forward by a small group of like-minded countries, by the private sector, by other NGOs, to have a proof of concept, to have pilots that demonstrate some of these approaches can be achieved. And if the pilots are successful and the proofs of concept are successful, maybe that lowers the opportunity cost for adoption later on. So I just want to highlight a couple quick examples. We can talk about more of this in the question and answer. But one is we have AI. There's a lot of conversation about mitigating the risks of AI and bio, but AI is also a tool. How can we utilize open source information, whether that's data streams, publications, trade data, satellite imagery, use open source information and do AI analysis and other analyses to be able to look at this information, to be able to find patterns, or at least find triggers or tripwires that could lead to other questions, right? We are living in a day and age that we've already said that governments don't own all the labs anymore. Neither do pharmaceuticals. There's a large private industry base working in biotech that all have capabilities. Can we bring private industry leaders together to experiment with site visit procedures that incorporate sample and data collection, that both balance intellectual property protections with transparency, right? How can private industry, if we can get them to buy into certain approaches, for them to model a site visit that works for them, that is both transparent, but also protects their intellectual property, that could be a great proof of concept moving forward. There are other more conventional ways. I think we are very impressed with the leaps and bounds improvements of state parties submitting CBMs, but how can could a couple state parties that are interested come together and say, how could CBMs be improved? Maybe updating forms, informing or coming up with analytical capabilities, or even demonstrating a way to help other countries fill out their forms to bring that number even higher. So you don't need consensus to bring everybody together to do this. You could just start coming up with what that form could look like with a group of like-minded countries. And the last thing I'll say is we have seen some state parties on their own become regional leaders. We've seen Botswana really help the Southern Africa region try to increase their national implementation, increase their policy frameworks, right? Can we see more regional leaders popping up, either in regional organizations or as individual state parties, to start increasing adoption and national implementation? So none of these involve full consensus of the BWC, and many of these don't include that much more necessary resourcing. But our idea is to put forward a report soon that details these science and technological, procedural and institutional approaches that could be piloted, that could be shown as a proof of concept, that maybe later down the road could be full adoption, but at least could start moving the ball forward and increasing the conversation. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm sure there will be questions about these ideas a little later. Just as an aside, I think it's a little bit wrong to compare the budget of BWC, which I know is vastly underfunded, but to compare it to CWC or IAEA or even CTBTO for that matter is a little bit off, because they all have huge inspection people and equipment and so forth dealing with it. So until the day that BWC has it, I don't think their budget is going to increase to the same level as those other organizations. Okay, John.
Thanks, Jennifer, and especially for pushing for this event for, since we first started talking about it last year, and of course the National Academies, Tricia and Maggie for making it happen, and then everyone here today and also online. Thanks for taking the time. As Ambassador Jenkins mentioned, it's great. We have over 190 countries that have taken this obligation freely. And it looks like maybe only 4 we have some issues with, based on the state compliance report as my reference for that. So it's great to have that moral underpinning and that rationale, but how do we get there? How do we get to the next step? And what do we do about it? The way I think about it is weapons are chosen for a reason, basically because they can have a certain effect. So as long as a nation state, non-state actors, or disgruntled individual thinks that they can cause mayhem and death and destruction, kill people, injure them, livestock, ruin crops, then there's a potential that biological weapons will be pursued. But what if we were able to prevent those effects from happening? I mean, now no one is too worried about an infantry unit having long pikes, but 700 years ago, that was a big deal, right? No one gets too excited about a wooden ship with a bunch of canvas and the 32 cannon broadside getting underway, right? We've taken these things off the table. And so one of the things that we look at on the Council on Strategic Risks is what we call deterrence and denial, deterrence by denial. What if we have technologies that weren't even imagined 50 years ago when the treaty came into force in order so we can detect things early? We can use amazing advances in wastewater epidemiology, the sequencing technology we've seen with PCR and also metagenomic next generation sequencing, so we can find out about an outbreak earlier. Not only would this help know if a biological weapon has been used, but you're getting triple points because it's going to have a public health effect if there's a naturally occurring disease, or also just as we talked earlier with biosecurity, if there's an issue with a lab or something gets out. All of these are going to be helped taken care of by things like that. You can also use mRNA platform technology, as we saw during COVID, in order to more rapidly come up with a vaccine. We can start working on therapeutics faster and personal protective equipment. And then through biomanufacturing, we can make a lot of these things at the point of care, not necessarily centralized and worry about shipping them around the world. So through these technologies, again, that weren't even considered when the treaty came into effect, we have a way to deny these weapons of their effect, which enables the countries around the world to not have to do as much as far as verification and rely on people's goodwill. They can basically make these weapons ineffective, and so they're not going to be chosen. And that's one of the things that we look at on the Council on Strategic Risks, is that proposal. So working together, we can achieve the goals of this treaty that came into effect 50 years ago today, and I look forward to talking about it further. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad to hear we don't need verification then. Daniel, you've got the whole legend of FAS to back up.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. It's great to be here. I'm honored to be sitting among this group. I know there's a lot of expertise in this room and on this panel, and I want to just congratulate folks on reaching this critical milestone. There is a lot to reflect on and a lot to celebrate, and it's also an opportunity to plan for how we can make even greater progress over the next 50 years. Let me first just give a little context and background on how I come to this conversation. I'm a bit of the odd person out when I look across this august group. I'm not someone who has had long and significant engagements on this topic or in this community. And so you might be wondering, like, why am I here? In addition to our organization's longstanding commitments and the work that we've stood behind Jennifer undertaking over the past several years, I come to this topic with a slightly different perspective and background that I thought I'd just give you a little bit of context. So for starters, I had the opportunity to serve in government at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And in that work at the intersection of science and technology policymaking and the technical community, I saw a couple interlocking, mutually reinforcing challenges that I think are quite generalizable. The first was just that I barely had time to do my own job. Most of what I ended up doing, and Dave, having recently left service like this, this is probably familiar. The people that are on the front lines of actually engaging in policymaking are mostly in a position of being on their back foot and having to be quite reactive. Two, I found that as someone whose job it was to work with the technical community, I found that folks were often really ill prepared to engage in policy at all. Like most of what I would have needed or my colleagues would have needed in order to enact change, launch new initiative, make it happen was lexicon that lived in my world, but not in theirs. And so I think that there's a generalizable challenge that I would suspect resonates in this domain as well as many others that I've had the opportunity to work in, which is that it's really hard for technical experts to understand how to plug into policy processes. And it's hard for policymakers to get the bird's eye view that the technical expertise can give them as well as road mapping a path forward and doing what they need as far as pre-work to play offense, not defense. And so one of the core reasons that policy doesn't change, from my view, is that these dynamics persist. And so for me personally, this turned into a thesis of how policy can change. We call it policy entrepreneurship. And it's a way of thinking about equipping policymakers with better ideas that are ready for implementation. We've been testing this for a few years. We've applied it across all sorts of domains. And I can report that it actually just works incredibly well. We have been able to help catalyze billions of dollars in change, in policy change. So one example is the prior administration's signature bio initiative to create a DARPA for health. Like, that idea came from something that we incubated and helped land. So I think that there are some learnings that I bring from these experiences that are relevant to a world in which we need deeper science and tech informing and engagement in the BWC. Secondly, as the CEO of an NGO that focuses on data-driven policy and evidence, I think that there are some insights from navigating moments of immense change that we are on the front lines of. And so obviously in this context, we are grappling with change punctuated by drastic shifts in US policy and implementation, a multi-year Russian invasion of Ukraine, and rising geopolitical tensions. So it's easy to understand how some may question the treaty's relevance in 2025. But I think that's all the more reason for us to roll up our sleeves and think of new approaches that may be informed by new strategies. We as an organization have been doing important work in providing platforms for new experts and newer voices to fully participate in this process of informing and providing technical assistance and policy entrepreneurship across a whole variety of domains. I'll be the first to admit that in some areas, like, these wins are easy, right? And in a domain like this, in global security and catastrophic risks, these are enduring challenges. And it is imperative that we think about this pipeline of training and equipping and preparing the next generation to engage effectively, not just now, but into the future. So I think there's three things I just wanted to share up front with that backdrop. So one, we believe that technical experts must play a significant role in shaping the present and the future. I'm really heartened by some of the stakeholder efforts that are underway that have been led by many of the folks in this room to ensure that technical voices are integrated into strengthening the treaty, and believe that we should be continuing to champion and redouble those efforts. Second, if you go back to my first example of what it's like to be in a policymaking role that many of you have also served in, I would challenge us to find ways to set the technical community up for success. Like, when you get a PhD, it isn't as if your diploma comes with training for how to engage in diplomacy, right? Like, often for a lot of folks, this is an entire second education to navigate the unspoken norms, rules, and methods of operation that are totally opaque from the outside. And so I would love for FAS to play a larger role in training experts new to this world, new voices and scholars that may actually bring fresh ideas and passion that will be indispensable to where we go from here. And then finally, I'm hopeful that we can ensure, and I would like from our organization to play a role, that the future of biosecurity doesn't miss out on opportunity windows that may arise. Having a policy entrepreneurship mindset might actually open new doors in this domain, but even within the BWC itself. And that's the challenge that I would put to this group overall. In the world that I sit in, we think of this current moment obviously as one of great uncertainty, but something that I tend to call high variance policymaking. Like, there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty of what's going to come in the next month, much less the next year. And institutions that were ironclad actually feel quite tenuous. Near and peer competitors are filling gaps that the United States is leaving behind as it withdraws from the international stage. I think that is an invitation to re-examine some of the foundations that we thought were consensual, and what we believed we were building from. And I think it invites, on our part, an ambitious set of ideas to counter. So, as someone who's often seen this extremely difficult, and seemingly impossible ideas come to fruition, I balance this uncertainty with some hope. And I'm encouraged by the work of those in this room, and I'm looking forward to the conversation and what happens over the next 50 years. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was a very rich set of presentations here. I'm wondering if we could go directly to the audience for questions, or if any of the panelists have questions of each other.
I would
Nancy.
thank you especially, well, everyone, but thank you especially for your discussion, Daniel, of the this idea of entrepreneurship and so on. And one of the things that, this meeting would not survive without a discussion of Jo Husband's work across the decades. We're at the NAS. This is her home. And her last project, which I maintain is really fits into your idea in the opposite direction. Her last activity in the fall of 2019 at the meeting of experts was to pull together diplomats, biosecurity experts, super basic scientists, a lot of basic scientists, and a number of other fields, physicians and so on, to analyze using a specific framework. Technically, she was comparing two frameworks, but to use a framework, in other words, a decision tree, a series of questions that were formalized in a way to allow all these disparate groups to think about biosecurity, hair on fire scenario in the same way. And what I think that did was bring non-scientists into the scientists' realm in a way that was necessary and completely different from the lectures that we sit through on the sidelines, on the margins of the BWC, which are valuable and so on, but to actually really engage in the process of saying, here is an organism that synthetic organism using AI or using whatever. How is it a threat as a weapon? And often we concluded it was not, and that was really an intriguing over the weekend project. So I just wanted to throw that out there as one new way to think about entrepreneurship in the other direction. Thank you.
I love that. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that I personally have in mind when we think about what different models or approaches might make sense. When I think about an area like this, I think about the disparate communities that are equipped to take action in different policymaker seats. And I think I was encouraged by some of the other panelists' comments, because I think some of the pilots that Dave is talking about are significantly in line with the model that I'm familiar with, where outside-in change by piloting or trying things can create the context and prove out enough where it maybe, if not now, but in some time down the road, these ideas and these models might be embraced and adopted by states parties. Yeah.
Okay. Questions online? Is that what's on the screen here? Okay. I understand Gregory Koblenz has a question. Could you please go ahead?
Hi, thanks all for a great panel. So my question is, how do you look forward to efforts to strengthen the Biological Weapons Convention, given that the treaty relies on consensus-based decision-making, and there's a very well-established pattern of individual states playing a spoiler role in blocking any progress on the treaty? And in light of that pattern, what alternatives do you suggest for strengthening the treaty outside of the formal process in Geneva? Thanks.
Okay, Gigi?
Sure, that is, I mean, I hope that that is part of what we're addressing when we do these studies on, for example, on confidence building measures, when we talk to many delegations in all of the different regions, and, you know, always seeking to expand the people we talk to. But when we talk to people, we find out what's important to them, to their nations, and then we present it and say, you know, this is something that everybody agrees upon. And I think that outside, you know, validation of like, this is what everybody thinks is the best path forward. Why are you not doing this as well? I think that helps. I think that's something that we should do more of. I think it would be helpful to have more transparency in as much as we can to because you know, decisions that are made in counter to most of the state's parties are you know, I think it's best to call it out. If it's not in the best interest, it's not in the desires of most of the nations that are there.
Thanks. I mean, I know over the years that by and large, there was an average of half of the state's parties who would comply with the confidence building measure reporting. But I think in recent years, it's gone up drastically. I think there were as many as 100 who have done it this year. So that's an improvement. But there's been continuous discussion about how to improve these measures. I don't know if any of you have worked on that. Yes.
Well, I was just going to respond to Greg's question as well, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So, you know, I think you're right. Consensus is hard. I think there was a lot of hope for the December meetings that just happened going in. And I think there was not a lot of happiness leaving Geneva in December. But I have heard from people that we've talked to that there's still interest in continuing discussions, right? And so while consensus is hard, this is where I was getting to the pilot programs, to like-minded countries trying to come up with ideas, to single nation, I mean, you can call them single nation entrepreneurs that want to start leading efforts in their region. So you don't need everybody to do everything all of the time. You can take steps forward that can lead to larger, more drastic changes. But if we can have NGOs, private organizations, academic organizations, small groups of like-minded countries that start to move forward on certain ideas, certain approaches, and prove that they're useful, that can gain traction, right? The static coefficient of friction is large, but once you get past that, balls will move down the hill. So,
Well, great. We can hope that will lead to consensus in the end
Yeah,
among all the states parties. That's the final problem. But
yeah, I just want to say that I think the actions will help create that environment. It's not going to happen overnight, but we'll build on that. We'll see the momentum when people see that you're able to do things together and have an effect that'll build that, help create that.
I think it'd be useful also to have working across regions on this kind of thing as well. I think there's a question in the room, but Michael Imperial has a question as well online.
Do you want me to go first?
Michael? Please go ahead, Michael.
Oh, hi, Michael Imperielli, University of Michigan. So as I was thinking about what the first panel was talking about in terms of the breadth of the bioeconomy and such, and the number of practitioners, I'm wondering whether we have a fundamental issue related to the Bioweapons Convention, which is that most life sciences don't even know what it is. So for many years, I would start talks about dual use to scientists and ask, how many of you have heard of the BWC? And the number of hands that go up in the room is incredibly low. And so I'm wondering whether it would help with respect to the BWC to increase awareness in the life sciences community. And if so, how do we do that?
Good question. Anybody in the room have an answer to that? I think obviously it would start with education. Because I agree, anybody I've talked to outside of the BWC community, most people have never heard of it.
So I'd like to, there are a lot of scientists who have heard of the Biological Weapons Convention because they have to They have much more contact with biosecurity measures. And so anyone who works with select agents, anyone who is in a scientific area that has been critiqued for, that is under fire, like virology is in the US, there's a lot more awareness of the laws and policies related to biosecurity, including the Biological Weapons Convention. But of course, we have more work to do. And one effort that was undertaken with Nancy and the Inter-Academy Partnership and Johns Hopkins and the Tianjin University was to create a biosecurity code of conduct. And that almost got written into the BWC, but that's one more thing to, I guess, blame Russia for. But there could be a future time. But that's an opportunity to have discussions with people. It's a great educational tool to bring people into why the BWC exists and what it means to people in the lab. It's not just pipetting.
Thank you. No, I think the Tianjin guidelines were really a successful effort and unfortunately didn't get put into the final document. Yes, we have a question in the room.
Great. Thank you very much. It's good to see so many old faces and new faces in the room today. Sam Weiss-Evans. I'm with the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology. And we heard from quite a few people on this panel about the need for new voices and new ideas and engagement, and giving like the ways that we can give space to those new sets of ideas and opportunities to not just revitalize the BWC, but also expand the goals of achieving biosecurity nationally and internationally. And I'm just reflecting on the fact that the mean age in the room is reflexive of there being 50 years of the BWC, and I'm curious to actually hear from some of those. I know I'm old, and I'm curious to hear from some of those voices in the younger generations as well about what their perspectives are on opportunities to engage. Like it's laudable, I think, the work that NTI and FAS and others are doing to give space to that community. I just want to hear from them as well.
You just like basically volunteered to come talk to one of my classes.
Amazing. I want to come listen to one of your classes, Gigi.
So I would say, first of all, thank you. I think, Hopkins, FAS, CSR, NTI, we all have really great next generation programs. I know Gabby and Greg in the room have been running one for a while. And I'll also say one of the people that our next gen delegation brought to the BWC once is currently, I think at this exact minute, giving a speech in Geneva at the BWC as a personal invite from the UN, right? So it is so important. And to one point that Mike Imperiale just said, I would have one asterisk and caveat over life science researchers don't know about the BWC. I think it is academics writ large. Coming from political science, they know everything since the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s about nuclear treaties. In my PhD program, I was informing my professors about the Biological Weapons Convention, right? So I think it's not just life science, it's political science, it's all of the sciences, social sciences as well that are included. So thanks.
I wanted to just jump on that real quick on the education side, having served in the U.S. Navy. It's a really good idea to train 19-year-olds on the rules for the use of force and rules of engagement so they can understand it, but it's also the why, because that's not something they just automatically come with. So I think we can do the same thing in academia on a lot of these programs so they understand why it's needed, where it came from, and also the benefits.
And the conversation has to include iGEM. Literally thousands of young people every year who are fed out across the world, entering the field, entering both academic fields and industry with a solid background in biosafety and biosecurity, including the BWC. That's a remarkable organization.
I think also the UN ISU is bringing young people to Geneva. Not a huge program because they don't have enough money, but at least they're trying.
Can I just add, I think that something I I almost think that this conversation relies on a set of assumptions that we need to challenge. So, do we need the broader community to be like knowledgeable about the BWC specifically, or do we need them to be interested and animated by the possibility of making progress on biosecurity as an important overall endeavor, right? It's like up a level. And I think where we have seen the next generation find religion on these sorts of topics, it's through framings that actually bring it alive to them. And so I think like effective altruism is out of vogue right now as like a way to think about these issues. But the number of people in the last 3 years who have come up to me fresh out of college, they're like, I am an effective altruist and I want to work on the most important catastrophic risks. And so, and I think these issues fit into that framework in a very powerful way. And so I think speaking the language and being cognizant of how many folks are entering these conversations is how we're going to revitalize a bunch of this discourse and get more people motivated and animated about this.
Thanks. Kavita.
Hi, I'm Kavita Berger from the National Academies. I want to actually go back to something that Nancy said, but it kind of follows some of the discussion that we've just had, and that is how we keep pace with new advances in the life sciences, particularly when these advances have potentially very little impact for one reason or another on BWC related S&T. And so the life sciences, biotech, the convergence of the life sciences with other disciplines is actually quite expansive. And we often apply how we think about work with pathogens and toxins and delivery vehicles to other areas. In fact, most recently, Rania and Lupjo just did a pilot as part of the BWC on looking at AI and biosecurity and so what a scientific advisory mechanism might look like. And so I'm just sort of wondering, from your kind of where you sit, where you're looking ahead, how we can actually keep pace with that and how we have a measured, informed decision about what the concerns are and where the opportunities of these technologies to help us get a better handle on where the concerns are, not just where the bad things are, and how we don't think everything is a catastrophic risk. I'm sorry. I just have to say that.
Well, if I may just mention also the part of the reason for the proof of concept that we conducted on doing a really kind of an S&T mechanism was to show that such an S&T mechanism could work in Geneva. And that's one of the reasons we need to bring science and technology into the room to obviously to educate those who don't know anything about it, but to try to keep pace with what's going on in biotech. Anybody else would like to add?
I'd like to make a comment. Kavita's point is well taken that that there's the life sciences, but there are these these parallel efforts moving along that are highly relevant to what we are actually concerned about, which is biological weapons, not technology. And therefore, I would think about environmental work to stabilize plants, work that goes on in agriculture, in physics, in how particles are stabilized, in dissemination techniques and so on. And the pharmaceutical industry is quite interested now in figuring out other ways to deliver drugs. That is relevant. I would add, though, that that the discussion that took place in Geneva in 2019 often came down to realizing that many of the frightening sort of developments that people could come up with pointed only to assassination weapons. That weapons could only be used against a person or a very small group of people. So, these issues of broad dissemination are really important and I would say not discussed. So what that means is that both ag and the health industry, medical industries, need to be brought into the fold. And I would, well, we've said this in many different ways, but here's another reason.
Thank you. I have a comment from somebody in the online, Angie Rasmussen.
Hi, thank you so much for allowing me to comment. I'm Angie Rasmussen. I'm a virologist at the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization at the University of Saskatchewan. And kind of going back to the issue of academics being able to understand and engage with the BWC, I'd kind of like to hear the panel's perspective on how you can better educate some of my academic colleagues about these issues and also distinguish between the finer points of actual biological weapons, risky technology, potentially risky research. Because in my experience, these things have been somewhat conflated, and disinformation about and lack of technical expertise has actually driven a lot of the public discourse about this, and it's going to impact the way that actually all virology and pathogen research is regulated, at least in the US. And I was struck by Daniel's comments about the effective altruism movement. And while I agree that we do need to do a better job of engaging the next generation of scientists, I agree with Kavita that not everything is a catastrophic risk. And often, in my experience anyways, the effective altruism take on this is based on these hypothetical scenarios that sometimes are sort of amplified and pumped up by disinformation, by motivated people who don't necessarily care about shoring up the BWC and making it stronger, but actually have other objectives in terms of their preferred policy, their preferred way of regulating science, and in some cases, actually anti-vaccine or other more nefarious, I guess, objectives. So how do we and how do you think we should approach, I guess, trying to help people understand what the BWC is, help them understand how it applies to their lives and their research, and become advocates for it without sort of divorcing themselves from the technical aspects of doing pathogen research and the benefits that it offers, doing non-bioweapons pathogen research, as opposed to exploring these hypothetical risks that actually are often not completely in touch with reality.
Thank you. Anybody want to take that on, Nancy?
You go ahead, Nancy. Yeah. Well, okay. So for folks who, I think it's a great comment. Totally agree. My point is not that I think this group needs to wholeheartedly endorse the tenets and the movement of effective altruism, but more just to recognize that like there's a lot of interest among emerging talent around that framing. And just for folks who are not tracking this movement closely, like its core tenets are that we should be working on problems that are important, that are tractable, and that are overlooked. And so like this is how resources are flowing to things like eradicating lead from paint across the world, like very worthy and important goals. There's a whole set of political considerations and stuff like that. But when, emerging technical talent expresses an interest in like, I want to go work on important problems that matter too. Like, I think you have to be ready for the conversation and tell them why this is actually arguably among the most important things that they could be doing. So it's more a comment on that. I agree with the point on education. One other point I just want to make, I mean, I know we're talking about academics specifically. I just think that like one question I have is like, are we seeing something of an unbundling of the university that is in the backdrop of all of this? So we're seeing more philanthropic money flowing to labs and initiatives that are outside of the university walls. And I think that's going to continue to be a growing community, especially as universities are in the cultural crossfire. And so I wonder how that informs what this community looks like, what governance looks like, and what bioweapons and regimes might mean in the future. So I just want to put that out there too, because I think that's like relevant to the broader conversation.
Thank you so much. We have one other question from Yupcho, and then I'd like to get the panelists' responses to my question about key action points that states parties could take going forward. So, Yupcho, quickly.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer, and remembering the proof of concept exercise that we did on SNT, you included as well, and the idea was exactly to see how this can function were it to be created. So I want to perhaps come back to Dave's idea of these kinds of proofs of concept around different issues that I can certainly subscribe to the value of such things. There is one thing that I think one should be wary of within the BWC context, and let's remember that that's what we're talking about here. That and all of a sudden I see a vertical and a horizontal axis, and on let's say on the vertical one is that there is this BWC. So there's like a high concentration of a regime complex of a lot of things coming together, and what this is all about. And the alternative, the most dangerous extreme alternative is it breaks down. There's no more norm. There's no more, the treaty itself is irrelevant. And in between is a plurilateral approach to things where, well, Australia group does export controls and this does that and this does that. And we may come to a point where nothing is happening in the BWC and that becomes a necessity. I don't think we're there. And I don't think that, so I think that there should be care on that aspect where you don't start threads that do take a life of their own and all of a sudden, because of that, start endangering the convention itself. So I think that's something to bear in mind. The other thing that comes to mind is this need, and it was mentioned this morning, and it's been mentioned by many brilliant minds in years, including Matthew Messelson, is that going back to the Chemical Weapons Convention, to which Bob has contributed a lot in developing and in negotiating, Mikolak here, the history of it shows that it was very important to have a distinction of a good use and a bad use of chemistry. So we don't have that in the life sciences and biology specifically. We haven't really done that. And within that realm of the chemical weapon of chemistry, the Chemical Weapons Convention played a key role in delineating what is good use of chemistry and what is bad use of chemistry. And there is that opportunity here as well. It could be done through, let's not use that V word, but something similar to it, where you need to involve private industry for that. And there are ways of doing that. I think they can. This is the one argument that can bring them into the fold to have that conversation. This can be to your benefit, because once we created the delineation of good and bad uses, we can have a different kind of a conversation. So all of a sudden, I have a vertical and a horizontal axis, and on this horizontal axis is this good and bad use. So where do we find it? The BWC itself, and how can it contribute to this broader regime complex of good uses and bad uses, and a high density of a multilateral functioning, mostly concentrated perhaps around the BWC, but not only, and then a breaking down of all of that and kind of plurilateral approaches to that. So I just wanted to perhaps throw that, to that idea of bringing in young people, like what is relevant to them? Well, I think that it would be relevant for them to have that delineation clear, so that they themselves, first of all, are informed, and then can contribute to the good uses of biology and life sciences. And if not, then we at least know that is the case. So thoughts?
Thank you so much. I think we could continue on this for quite a long time, but I think the governors have told us we're running out of time. So if I could just get the responses from each of the panelists about points that they would recommend for government, for key states parties to take going forward. Nancy, have you ideas?
Well, I made a little list, but interestingly, each topic has been slightly altered by this conversation, which is a good sign. The first was the Scientific Advisory Board, of course, and we've been pushing for that for, a couple decades. But I like the idea, Georg, your idea, and some of these others, and mine, or Joe, of communication from scientists to diplomats, and a discussion of framework, organized, coded discussion of both benefits and risks, benefit assessment as well as risk assessment. Benefit assessment, of course, is really difficult, but ISU funding and bring back big pharma, saving time here.
Great. Gigi.
So I have been, as far as scientific advice to the delegates and exchange, I think it's really important for people who are not involved in doing science. You don't want them to become scientists, but they should be able to ask the right questions. So having mechanisms at the BWC where they bring scientists to be able to understand a little bit more so that they can be informed enough to be able to ask questions of the experts that they have in their nation, I think is critically important. So there's a variety of mechanisms for that. I think confidence building measures, when they are refined, should be made public. And I think that being able to have transparency there could be helped by NGOs, and I think that provides assurance beyond the states parties to other groups. And then finally, we have to, because there aren't active biological weapons being used, that, I mean, this, at least not until when I sat down here, I really, the BWC becomes a little bit of a playground for other geopolitical issues, and the geopolitical issue that needs to be dealt with is disinformation. And so we need to really tackle that, and other nations need to step up, and NGOs need to step up to do what we can to counter that, because the US is not going to be helpful for a while.
Thank you so much. I mean, your first point certainly goes a long way towards the S&T advisory mechanism. Again, thank you.
Yeah, so I will limit my points since many of them have already been said. I think the main point that I would say, the main urge, is after December to just ensure that the state parties go back to the table in good faith. I think there is a risk of last December completely derailing and providing a really strong headwind. So I think just having all the states parties go back to the table in good faith to continue that conversation. And then I guess in defense of the pilots, I would say there is a cost of action and there is a cost of inaction. And I think there are risks to both options, but I've seen joint papers be submitted before between countries. I've seen joint papers be submitted between NGOs, and therefore it's not uncommon to have groups start working together to try to move a conversation forward. So the cost of inaction is nothing happens. And the cost of action is maybe something happens, but in no way should it be suggested that it should be to go around the BWC to decrease the utility or importance of the ISU. It should be all in support of the broader convention.
Great, thank you. So we can certainly look forward to December and another 50 years at least.
Yeah, so I'd say to create that environment for the BWC, for it to become more effective, for that good faith to develop, it's to take action now. The things I talked about earlier, working on early warning, diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccine development, academic programs that talk about the ethics, biosafety, and also the BWC. That's going to have a benefit for each country that does that, for their biodefense, for their public health, and also the viability of their agriculture. And I think by doing that, you can eventually create the moment that it's going to be right for the treaty to become more effective.
Great, good positive thinking. Thank you.
So I agree with a lot of that, and I would add two things. One, I think continuing to find new pathways for the science and technology community to inform and participate. And so Jennifer, the work you've been doing, I think we need to put on steroids in the future, and I'm hopeful that FAS can play a bigger role in this, and I expect that we will. And then second, just an example. So if I think about the climate movement, it is at a crossroads. We are hurtling towards milestones that we do not want to hit, right? And at the same time, we are scaling back, at least in the United States, our commitment to decarbonization. And this is a crisis. This is causing within the community a tremendous amount of reflection on what to do. And one emerging thread that I think is analogous here is a growing movement among the research community to focus on what are called climate emergency actions. So geoengineering, different types of things that sound totally absurd, not with a plan to deploy them, but to be more ready should they be required to buy us more time, right?
And this is like deeply politically controversial. Everyone's first instinct who cares about decarbonization is like, that is batshit, right? We should not be, excuse my French, that should not be doing that. And so I think it is the kind of challenge that is exogenous to the community that may be analogous to what is happening here and into the future, and the kind of outside the box thinking that is mandated. So I thought I'd end with that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that brings us to an end, unfortunately, but I can see smoke coming out of the chimney, and I appreciate very much everybody's engagement. Thanks again.
All right. So last but definitely not least, we have Katie Bowman, who will be moderating our final panel of the morning. I guess it's afternoon now. Katie is the Senior Program Officer with the Board on Health Sciences Policy at the National Academies, and a former BLS member, if I'll mention Board on Life Sciences. And the co-director of the ongoing study, Newborn Screening, Current Landscape and Future Directions. Katie has worked on and directed many different activities while at the academies, and also takes part in activities that explore advances in science and their potential impacts for biological and chemical security, including the study that produced the report from 2018, Biodefense in the Age of Synthetic Biology. So we're in good hands with Katie. I will pass it over to her.
Well, thank you, Tricia, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's true that I've had the opportunity to work on a number of different topics at the National Academies, which is really one of the great pleasures of working at the institution, working with all of our committee members and volunteers and experts. And I have had the chance in the past to work on some of our projects related to biological and chemical weapons security with the international partners in some of our academies of sciences and medicine around the world, and through the inter-academy partnership. So it is a great pleasure to try and close out this event looking at both the past and celebrating the past of the biological weapons, and then the future as we look ahead. And so I think our final panel is really going to extend the conversation that we were having just now in the last session on both how science and technology can lead to some new risks and challenge some of the thinking around biosecurity, but also lead to some new opportunities. And so we're going to hear from some panelists talking about how they think of the assessment of science and technology, where it poses new risks and presents new opportunities in terms of frameworks for assessment, for public health, and response to emerging disease threats, and also how education and training help support and sustain responsible use. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. We have three of them joining us virtually, and Rocco here sitting next to me. So Mike Imperiali is the Arthur Thurnau Professor Emeritus in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at the University of Michigan, and previously the Associate Vice President for Research on Research Policy and Compliance. He was an inaugural member of the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, and he's led a number of Academy's efforts, including being part of the study that Tricia just mentioned, the 2018 report, Biodefense in the Age of Synthetic Biology, and then a recent one, co-chair of the Committee on Assessing and Navigating Biosecurity Concerns and Benefits of AI Use in the Life Sciences. So he's joining us virtually. We're going to hear from him in a second. Let me just introduce the panel briefly. I know we're running a little short of time this afternoon since there were so many good conversations. Sitting next to me is, I'm very pleased to introduce Rocco Casagrande, who's Managing Director at Deloitte Consulting, and previously founder and Managing Director for Griffin Scientific, which has done quite a lot of work focusing on assessing and developing systems to consider the implications of biorisks and enhance biosafety, including in areas like screening for synthetic DNA sequences and other areas of biorisk management. And I think, interestingly, previously served as a UN biological weapons inspector, so has a great deal of history in this area of biorisk assessment and management. And also he, let me say, co-chairs the National Academy's Standing Committee on Advances and National Security Implications of Transdisciplinary Biotechnology. So somebody who also we've had a great pleasure to work with here at the Academies. Also joining online is Julie Fisher, who works on global health security and biosecurity policy. And Julie was the first technical director for global health at CRDF, leading and working with multidisciplinary and multi-country teams to support the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's work on strengthening capacities to respond and detect emerging disease threats with partner countries around the world. She was previously the director of the Elizabeth R. Griffin Program at the George Washington University and with the Milken School of Public Health. Her focus has really been on these issues of detection and response to emerging public health events and partnerships that can strengthen capacity for disease detection and response. And then our last panelist, also joining online, is Maria Espona, who is a biologist, researcher, and teacher at the National Defense School in Argentina and has taught at various universities in Argentina, Georgia, and Peru. So we're very pleased to have her joining us virtually as well. She has a Master of Terrorism Studies and a doctor in criminology and is currently doing postdoctoral research on biological weapons and disease surveillance from a One Health perspective, as well as having a lot of expertise as co-director of information quality in Argentina, which focuses on promoting information methodology and quality methodology in Spanish-speaking countries. She is also a member of the WHO's Technical Advisory Group on responsible use of the life sciences and dual-use research. So her expertise has been in export control and WMD technologies, as well as in education and training through her work in all teaching in these various universities. So let me stop introducing these excellent speakers. And what we're going to do, as with the last panel, is focus on opening remarks. And then let's try to make sure that we have some time for you all to engage in discussion. And we are going to start with Mike Imperiali joining us online. So over to you, Mike.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And thanks to the academies for asking me to participate. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today. So I'd like to focus on the intersection of AI and biology and how that relates to the BWC. So the study that Katie mentioned on this topic was released about 10 days ago, and there'll be a public webinar next week for those of you who are interested. And that study relied on the 2018 study that Katie also mentioned, and there are various people here today who contributed to one or both of those studies, and so I'd like to acknowledge their contributions. So what I'd like to do is give you a very high-level summary of how I think the more recent report relates to the BWC. And I also want to mention that this intersection of AI and biology was one of the 5 themes discussed at the recent meeting celebrating the 50th anniversary of Asilomar. And I think that we'll be hearing more about that meeting in the coming weeks and months. So stay tuned for that. So there's justifiable apprehension that AI can be used to design and produce biological agents. People have raised concerns that it might be used to modify a pathogen or even create a new one from scratch. This is not as simple as it sounds, however, at least not with today's AI capabilities. But as we know, AI is rapidly evolving to do more and more, and therefore we must monitor how its capabilities change over time and be prepared for the implications of such changes. Despite this, we mustn't forget that AI can already be used to protect us from biological threats. It can be employed for different types of surveillance, to design vaccines and other medical countermeasures. And these capabilities already exist, and I think that they will only get better with time. So I think that AI can contribute in a very positive way to the goals of the treaty. So my key point then is that right now, the benefits are more readily applicable than the threats, and we can put dynamic processes in place to maintain that superiority, given the pace at which improvements in AI are occurring. And so I just want to cut off my introductory comments right there, keep them brief so we could have maximum time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And now I think picking up on some of those issues will be Rocco Casagrande.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the academies for the invitation. Because it's spring and here in DC, the dogwoods are the magnolias are in bloom. I want to start with a ray of hope. I think one of the good advancements in the last couple of years is some very positive headway in making biorisk management, specifically biosafety, a science. Historically to date, biosafety is more of an experience-based art because we don't really have the data on understanding what accidents are really caused by, what contributes to risk, what exacerbates those risks, what makes things exactly safer. And I think over the last few years, there's been several investments, including by the US State Department, to understand how really what is a good scientific research agenda to begin to address these critical and longstanding gaps to improving biosafety. That's important and relevant to the BWC for a couple of reasons. We've just talked about how the BWC and maybe other reasons related to fear of retaliation has prevented the use of biological weapons, even though we feel that there are certain proliferator nations that have been working on making pathogens maximally dangerous for decades. They haven't necessarily used them. And so perhaps I postulate that the most obvious avenue for harm from state-level biological weapons is unintentional acts, either an accident or theft. And so making biosafety and biosecurity as robust as possible is a counterproliferation goal. And I think just to wrap up here, building on Mike's comments, as AI advances and as AI can help us describe biological structures that are more and more novel, more and more distinct from those that we have experience with, biosafety that is based on analogy from what we do know or based on experience becomes less and less relevant. And so needs to be underpinned more and more by this hard empirical evidence that I hope we continue to build.
Oh, thank you so much. I think now we're going to turn to you, Julie Fisher.
Thank you so much. And I also apologize that I'm not in the room with you today. In my place, if you could just please stare fixedly at Rocco while I deliver my remarks, I think that will work out for everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about advances in overall laboratory diagnostic capacity that current and emerging technologies offer. And just to try to emulate my colleagues in touching on this briefly to start a discussion. I begin with the observation that historically, researchers have estimated that up to 60% of patients with serious infections may not have a causative pathogen identified definitively, even where clinical testing is available. And that has implications for the BWC, because when we're thinking about capacities to be able to detect and characterize biological agents rapidly, that affects attribution, but it also affects ability to send the message that an event will be detected in such time that it serves as a deterrence for those who might otherwise be speculating on use of agents. What has changed in the past few years is that as a result of the response to the acute COVID-19 pandemic, laboratory systems obviously leapt forward dramatically. Many countries that had previously had nationwide testing capacities, particularly for respiratory pathogens, but the technologies can be applied to many classes of pathogens. Nations that had testing capacities for hundreds of PCR tests per day expanded to hundreds of thousands. And for the first time, many of these countries used next generation sequencing on a widespread basis for public health purposes. The infrastructure and the testing capabilities to support that are now more widely available than ever in countries at every level of socioeconomic development. And that means that with these advancing capabilities to detect and characterize unusual biological threats or unusual biological events, we could think about the changing strategies for how we apply these technologies for both pathogen-specific and pathogen-agnostic testing and surveillance. And that includes approaches that are standoff, or approaches that can detect signs that a pathogen has been manipulated. So, for example, some of these technologies that have gained wider use. We saw during the COVID-19 pandemic the increasingly mainstream use of environmental sampling surveillance strategies combined with next generation sequencing to conduct wastewater surveillance and air sampling. So these are non-invasive methods of detecting pathogens that, because they don't require interactions between a symptomatic individual and a formal healthcare system with strong public health functions aligned and integrated, delays can be reduced at each step that would normally be introduced in a more formal laboratory surveillance, laboratory testing to support disease surveillance. So just again, a factoid, studies have estimated that early in the COVID-19 acute pandemic, that wastewater surveillance offered a 4 to 10 day earlier warning of the start of COVID-19 waves than case data, which was delayed again along the line for a variety of reasons. Technologies themselves are evolving to accelerate detection and characterization of pathogens, including those pathogen agnostic approaches. In 2023, a survey of North American clinicians who see infectious disease patients reported almost 3/4 of them, 74%, reported that they have used some sort of advanced molecular testing to characterize a pathogen in a patient over the last 2 years, including not just genomic sequencing techniques, but metagenomic next generation sequencing, some RNA-based gene sequencing, and that they're looking at other coming technologies that will help them either characterize pathogens functionally in laboratory assays or using molecular diagnostics that based on CRISPR and targeted genome editing, more miniaturized approaches to sequencing and single cell sequencing. So just how do we pull all that together? We're seeing much more value placed on networking of laboratories based on shared protocols and norms so that we can produce actionable information and real casting. And we're seeing broadening of regional research and diagnostic networks, often networks that were built previously on specific focus, such as supporting vaccine trials or conducting surveillance for a very specific pathogen like dengue virus, broadened for more pathogen agnostic or wider pathogen detection, and developing training and peer-to-peer support and knowledge management protocols so that there's more functional networks. There have been more functional networks built around advanced molecular diagnostics in the US and Europe, including for wastewater surveillance. And there are proposals that some of these collaborations could be turned into broadly global platforms. For example, aircraft-based wastewater surveillance platforms that would allow genomic and travel-based disease surveillance that is not locked to a specific geography. So just in conclusion, laboratory networks and laboratory technical capabilities that include AI, that build on advances, are offering a lot of promise and providing early warning. And there are gaps that we have to overcome. Because I'm a pathological optimist, they're not gaps, they're challenges. How to use these technologies beyond the technical is a gap in nationally and globally understanding guidance for policy and practice, how to use data for action. We need highly trained specialists around the world to conduct, analyze, interpret, and collate data, whether it's experimental or diagnostic, to make any use of it, as well as computational resources that go well beyond the wet lab. And finally, we need to figure out what our analytic methods are in our pipelines to combine and interpret the results of pathogen agnostic assays. These are pretty immature frameworks right now, and there's a lot of work to be done. But the exciting thing is there's a lot of work to be done in the next 50 years. Thanks so much. And I'll turn it back to our moderator.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And let us hear then from our final panelist before we dive into the discussion. Maria Espon.
Thank you, Katie. Well, a lot have been said about the importance of education in the previous panels and interventions. And what I would like to add to that is that why education and training is important. And this is because it's sustainable, it's adaptable. We can use it in different cultures. We can implement programs adapted to the different needs of each country. And what I saw in the last few years is that there is a change of paradigm or trends before the countries were asking for training on specific topics, and now they said, maybe it's better to set up programs at the university and have our professors train and pass the knowledge to their students at the different levels. And this is not only for scientists, but also for scientists as biologists or biotechnologists experts, but also for political science, for security experts, for economy courses, such as the ones related to export control. And sorry for the cat, is uncontrollable as always. But what I think it's important of this as well is that by having more people knowing about the topics, we are breaking the language barriers and we are able to communicate better, because most of this hype that was mentioned before because of AI erupting in different spheres and creating fear in some experts of areas of knowledge is because of the lack of understandings. And we as humans are afraid of what we don't know. And by having education or training, depending on what is needed, what we are doing is breaking those barriers and improving the communication and improving the mutual understanding. And finally, so we can spend more time in the discussion, what I would like to say is that education is not only passing knowledge, it's also about practice and it's about behavior. It's us as professors doing what we said that our students should be doing. So not preaching, but leading by the example. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I think this is going to give us a pretty rich fodder for conversation. One thing that was striking me as all of you were speaking was really that a lot of developments that happen really outside of the context of the biological weapons are really pushing forward advances in science and technology. And so, you know, things that happened as a result of the COVID pandemic, things that are happening as AI is being developed for completely different uses, kind of change the way that this would have both promise and potential risks for the BWC. And so while I think our audience is maybe gathering its thoughts to ask questions, which I'm going to invite people to be prepared to think about, maybe each of our panelists could just reflect for a minute or two on how the types of frameworks and developments and approaches that you all mentioned, you know, is there something that you would specifically like the policymakers of the BWC to know about how this technology could affect the operations of the treaty as we look ahead? I guess if anyone wants to start, we don't have to go in order. Does anyone have thoughts on something that you would really like the BWC states, parties, and community to take from your comments? Julie, would you like to go first? It's hard for me to see it with our virtual folks who kind of raise your hand maybe if you're for our virtual panelists if you want to jump in. But Julie, I'm calling you because you look excited to say something.
Sure, I'd be happy to lead off. I mean, I think that understanding that the collaborative networks and the capabilities that are being developed globally for detecting an unusual biological event obviously apply to both naturally occurring, accidentally released, and deliberately occurring outbreaks. So I think that moving forward with this understanding that apart from the network of analytical laboratories that support the UN General Secretary's the UN Secretary General's mechanism, sorry, mangled that, there is a growing global capacity to detect unusual biological events quickly that may have standoff technologies that are not moored necessarily in geography, and a lot more information available on real casting, on understand what's happening in emerging biological events in real time, and that there's a lot of room for cross-fertilization and collaborative thinking about what those capabilities mean for the BWC, for deterrence, for preparedness, and how those laboratory networks that are being developed for public health and for health security create more tools thinking about the BWC.
Rocco.
Yeah, building on Julie's comments and also not just thinking about the BWC narrowly, but also just counter and nonproliferation in general. I think the last decade or so has seen some significant advances that are enabled by AI, but not purely AI. So for instance, the combination of AI and overhead imagery, I think is a humongously powerful tool for counterproliferation. Specifically, I mean, not to call them out, but as an example company, Planet, with its capability, its CubeSat satellites that I think are orbiting at about the same altitude that Maria is right now, can give you a picture of the entire, all the world's landmass with a 3.5 meter resolution every single day, and that it's viewed by AI systems that can cue you into particular activities you might be interested in. It's already used to identify like excavations for war crimes like mass graves. It's already used to look for deforestation. But I tell you, I mean, I know Iraq was a very unique case when it comes to counterproliferation, but had I had that capability 20 years ago that could tell me anywhere they were digging in a country the size of California, like even though we had overhead imagery, it was just too intense for humans to look over the entire country on any kind of with any kind of regularity. If I had that capability, it would have saved us an incredible amount of time, a lot of wasted effort. And so that is a humongous change. I think also AI's ability to sift through reams and reams of unstructured data related to purchasing and acquisitions and shipping and things like that can help identify suspicious activities that I think are a little bit easier to distinguish when it comes to dual use. Like the first panel described how biological research, and I think they meant biological research focused on biological agents, not biological weapons, is very difficult to distinguish from peaceful use. I think where that gets much easier is where you start getting down the biological weaponization chain to formulation and magnification and weaponization. The signatures of that could potentially be pulled out much more easily with AI. And I think that ability to detect activities that we just hadn't had before because humans can't possibly go through all those data and find anomalies is really can change the game.
Oh, that's such an interesting idea of sort of new opportunities that are being enabled. I don't know, Maria or Mike would either. Oh, yes, Maria.
Yeah, I would like to build on something that Rocco just mentioned, that is the word anomalies. This is what, when you are checking the data landscape, you can see, you can check how diseases behave normally, and if there's a spike and something, it's different. It might be natural or not, but you can see that, and with AI evolving, you can trace that much more easily. It's not that in the past we couldn't do it, but it was extremely time-consuming and in every sense possible. I believe that as a scientist, we are not scared, but excited about all these new uses and new opportunities. But the security community is scared. And I think that we are lost in translation here, that we need to improve our communication in order to reduce the fear of these kind of technologies. Because today is AI, what will be in 5 years? We don't know. And we cannot go from hype cycle to hype cycle all the time, because we are losing time. The scientists are working now in what we will be scared in 5 years. And it's the same for the scientists, that they are afraid of control. And you could say before that most of the scientists working with listed pathogens know about the BWC, etc. Well, that is not that usual in every country around the world. Maybe it's common in some countries, but not everywhere. So we need to increase this global awareness and include other countries that are far behind the ideal situation.
Thank you. Mike, was there anything you wanted to maybe add on to that?
I think I would just add one thing, with respect to the BWC, I mean, I can imagine, some of the things that Rocco was talking about in terms of, these new technologies could contribute to verification or assurance, whatever you want to call it. But of course, the question becomes, number one, how do you do that right? So is it going to be incumbent on individual nations to do that sort of surveillance and then report out? And then you can imagine all the mistrust that that's going to generate. And then the second question, of course, is how do you do this without throwing sand in the gears of the beneficial research that needs to be done in order to protect us, not just from biological weapons, but from natural outbreaks, as Julie was mentioning. So I think, you know, it's possible, but I think it's got to be given a lot of thought.
And actually, I'm going to maybe build a little bit on that, and then I'll take a question. But I think that just kind of extending the prior panel, we had a little bit of a conversation about the use of frameworks to help structure thinking and kind of clarify where people have common assumptions, or maybe they're approaching things from different ways, and build clearer ways for scientists and policymakers and economists and others coming from different areas of expertise to really sort of look at a challenge through slightly more common language. I think that was a point that maybe Nancy and some others on the prior panel were making. And so I'm just going to see if anyone wants to reflect on this sort of the strategies, I guess I would say, for doing what you were suggesting, Mike, which is how to think about how to approach this in a thoughtful way that is both not going to unduly impede the progress in the science community, but also make policymakers in the BWC and others aware of what the sort of the real risks and opportunities are, and kind of how to structure that conversation, and whether anyone on the panel has thoughts about these frameworks or these strategies for structuring conversations across very widely varying areas of expertise. So feel free to jump in if you do.
Yeah.
Maria.
Yeah, maybe I'm biased. I'm very structured in my thinking, but I think that what we are missing here is a structured approach and a real needs identification, and go step by step, like if we were preparing a project to do this. If we don't know, if we don't do a proper diagnosis of where we are standing now, where the issues are, we cannot move forward. We cannot plan and develop something that will deal with the problems that we currently are identifying. So the framework will be the result of a process. And first, we have to understand better where we are. And this includes something that Kavita mentioned, and I'm supporting very strongly, is that we always talk about risks. Let's talk a little bit more about all the good things that technology is bringing and all the good things that we can do by collaborating, and weigh better the risk and the benefits, because if not, it's like we are about to die every day. Certainly we are not. And there is much more positive things to do in the future.
Yeah, I think as was mentioned earlier, the BWC is a very flexible and short document, and that flexibility is its strength. But if you look at the tools with which various state parties try to enforce the BWC or implement it either within their own borders or with partner nations, those mechanisms are not particularly flexible, and they're often very list-based. I think we need to, as far as frameworks, get away from frameworks to implement the BWC within our borders and with export control, et cetera, that are much more flexible and risk-based and less list-based. That's hard to say. And that's going to become ever more important as AI and other biotechnologies kind of create new structures that are unanticipated, or ones that aren't related to existing structures. So, you know, that's something we really need to start investing in to get towards.
Thank you for that. Julie, did you want to say anything there?
Yeah, just if I could add very briefly, I think that building on what both of my colleagues have just said, thinking about what we mean by education and stakeholder engagement to broaden what we mean by these frameworks, to include, as was noted in the previous panel, the communities that are already extraordinarily aware of the BWC and its implications, and engaging a whole new generation of scientists and decision makers more proactively to think about what risks mean when you aren't tied to pathogens, will help in enabling the decision-making process, the policy framing process to get toward what Rocco just mentioned, and using the tools that Maria has cited. If we don't change our framework of thinking about the BWC and how it can be leveraged as well as how it can be supported, we're sort of stuck in these circular conversations, and there's room for so much more.
Thank you for that. Let me go to a question online. Robert Boyley.
Yes. Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Robert Boilly. I am the president-elect of the Academy of Science of Canada. And my question is about during the COVID-19 pandemic, what struck me is the speed at which the virus spread across the entire world, because mostly of modern transportation, and in particular airplanes. So may I have your point of view on the importance and feasibility of developing fast and reliable biosensors that could be used to scan merchandise and people traveling?
I'm happy. Okay. All right. I'll take a very quick take on that. So during the pandemic, one of the technologies that was tested widely that had been proposed before but not used above a pilot scale was wastewater surveillance of airplanes. Now, this gets the whole plane. It does not get individuals, but it was used by multiple countries in multiple regions effectively as a tool to understand what diseases were being spread across borders in a way that then allowed them to focus their resources for case-based surveillance and for interventions. So this is a technology that is environmental sensing, basically sampling the wastewater from the plane using an adapter to collect the specimen and then conducting molecular testing to characterize the pathogens. The technology already exists. It's a matter of moving from country by country pilot testing to more collaborative approaches that allow sharing of data across global networks. That technology exists now. The collaborations would let shared protocols be used to allow more rapid analysis of data sets. So it's very possible. It's already been tested and piloted.
Okay, but to scan each passenger of an airplane, for example, quickly, rapidly, you have the result in 5 seconds. That person is carrying unknowingly a virus or a microbe. Are we 10 years away from that technology or 50 years away from that technology?
Rocco, Mike, what do you think?
Well, Julie, I was just going to build on what you said. I think we have a long history of doing cost and benefit analysis of looking at pooled sampling for infectious disease versus individual sampling. And in many cases, pooled sampling is actually superior. That's one of the reasons why we've used it in agriculture for many types of direct disease surveillance for so many years. And I think when you're talking about international travel, air travel is one of those circumstances in which pooled sampling, I think if you look at all the possible costs, no matter what the technology looks like, may actually be superior. So I think it's more of an economics and feasibility argument than necessarily a technology argument. I do want to say, though, building on Julie's comments, when you look at wastewater screening and other forms of molecular surveillance, there are, just to emphasize something she said, there are a lot of data silos and data sovereignty issues that prevent information sharing. And once again, promising effort is hosted by the World Economic Forum to try to bridge all those different stakeholders, groups, and data sets to make one unified sense of biosurveillance.
Thank you very much.
Any other comments before we go to the next question? No. All right, then we'll take a question from the in-person audience.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Jackson DuPont, and I'm here
with the Council on Strategic Risks, and I'm answering the charge of the last panel to hear from young people, as I was, I believe, 1 year old when the Varix protocol fell apart. And instead of singing happy birthday, I wanted to ask a question. And while this question is directed at Rocco, it is also a question for everyone else in the room. And it is a bit human and philosophical, so apologies if it's not technical. But Rocco, you in your profession and expertise, you deal with the fallibility of people and how to design systems that can account for mistakes. And there's a real humility to that. And it is a great privilege to be in this room of champions, and people have been working on this for decades. But my question for you is someone who works with the human question of fallibility in designing humility into systems. What approaches or recommendations would you have to all of us to better account for our own fallibilities and design humility into the systems of science diplomacy and public-private partnership and accounting for emerging threat risks as we think about what the next 50 years of this convention will bring for us? Thank you.
Wow, you phrased that so well and so profoundly. I think my answer is going to be pale in comparison. So good for you. And also, I don't think I have a good answer to that. I would like to focus kind of more on the technical angle of that as someone who's not a policy person, someone who's more of a scientist. I think one of the best things that we can do to understand how human fallibility affects all things related to biorisk, whether that's security, safety, or not counterproliferation, is to gather a lot more data and to create frameworks with which we can set up experiments that are repeatable, quantitative, and that can lead to testable hypotheses. Because I think there's a lot of questions in biosafety and biosecurity, and I think also potentially in science policy that are amenable to experimentation. So for instance, you might think that it's very difficult to set up frameworks to understand how often people might lie in a laboratory, which speaks to a biosecurity risk. But one experiment we were involved with involved looking at human error rates for safety. But as they exited the laboratory, the volunteers, and there were hundreds of volunteers, were asked to wash their hands with soap. And then in some of the cases, we removed the soap, so they weren't able to do that. But then we asked them as they exited the room, how many of you actually washed your hands? You know, did you wash your hands with soap as you left? A lot of people were like, yeah, sure. Like that kind of noticing the frequency with which someone would be so cavalier about the rules to exit a laboratory might inform things like piggybacking, like allowing someone to piggyback into a lab, or other sleights of small lies that people might think have no real effect on the world. So I think setting up the right types of experiments, gathering those data, and then using those data to further inform how you will set up your frameworks to minimize risk is what's important. And we just need to do more of it. But I didn't really answer your question, and I'm acknowledging that because I don't have a good answer.
Anyone else on the panel want to reflect on humility and human behavior as it intersects with the issues we're talking about?
So I'll jump in there just because I have a PhD, and so it's a philosophical question, actually. With respect to humility, I don't know exactly how you measure that or build that into people's ethos, although I do know a few years back, and I think Nancy mentioned Malcolm Dando, and I seem to recall that he had basically convinced his university to include ethical training for all students, no matter what. And so that's one way, I think, right, you can try to approach that. With respect to fallibility and well aware of the things that Rocco is talking about, I often wonder why we can't take a page out of the airline industry. When they have had crashes and they do their investigations and they've learned how to fix things, and one of the things that they've done right over the years is to, as much as possible, automate flying, right? So pilots do the takeoff, and sometimes they do the landing. Sometimes the landing is even automated. So why can't we do that in laboratories where we're worried about risky agents and try to, as much as possible, take humans out of the equation. I think that's, an area of research that could be really useful.
Yes, Julie.
Just one quick, I don't think I have a good answer either, but I think that that building on what both Mike and Rocco said, part of this is with the acknowledgement that that we're trying to bring that we're all of a certain age. And as our speaker pointed out, getting younger people involved requires thinking about the assumptions and the decisions that the generations who have been working with the BWC over years or decades bring to assumptions about the BWC and what works, and to biosafety, biosecurity, and laboratory ethics in general. I think that part of it, what we can do to introduce humility, is do a better job in preparing and providing case studies as educators and mentors about why we make the assumptions we do. What decisions have scientists made that created risks intentionally or unintentionally? What is the way that morality has been a part of science, and not pretend that it is not a place where human morality and judgment make a difference? And use case studies that humanize accidents that have occurred. And again, that explain why we assume what we do, because what we assume is common knowledge on motivations gets lost from generation to generation. And unless we are honest about the decision that scientists have made that put others at risk, it's really hard to talk about the precedent and why we make assumptions that we do. And if those assumptions are still good because they're based on the essence of human nature, as in some of the research that Rocco does, or whether they are based on past assumptions and frameworks that have perhaps lost some of their relevance. I think we have to be honest. And maybe that honesty helps interject some of that humility.
The past couple comments actually made me rethink of perhaps to reframe an answer that might be more relevant to your question. I think one thing we have to be careful of is understanding how human factors speak to our understanding of where risks lie. So for instance, I think if you look at some of the data related to the misuse of AI in helping unsophisticated actors, those who aren't scientists, creating a biological weapon that already exists. So basically recapitulating technology that was pioneered by the US in the 1960s before we gave up our program. I think if you look there, a lot of the studies that look at how unsophisticated people with minimal training or with the assistance of AI fail all the time are using a pool of individuals that are a lot less motivated to succeed. If you look at studies that focus only on the most motivated individuals, you see a order of magnitude degree of difference in uplift. And that was shocking to me. I did not expect it. Like prior to reviewing the data on some of these lab-based studies of people with no scientific training whatsoever entering a lab and trying to conduct relatively sophisticated experiments with the help of an AI system, their abilities far outstripped anything I thought of because I didn't appreciate that human factor beforehand. So I would say it kind of colors, our past history kind of colors everything. And I don't think we really appreciate how different individuals can be in terms of their capabilities and therefore risks.
Excellent. I know we have a queue in the room. We're going to go for maybe about 10 more minutes and then we have to wrap up because we're well over, but I feel like we could keep having this conversation forever. So we'll get through as many questions as we can and let's take our next one from the room.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Thank you all for your incredible work and insights. I'm Monique Mansour with the MITRE Corporation. On the spectrum from humility to exuberance, rational or irrational, again, we all want to cure cancer. We all want to do the right thing. My mentor, Mike Mostrom, always said, the older I get, the less I know, because you realize how much you don't know. I heard an AI leader, a CEO of a major company recently say, that we're at sort of, they're mapping it to BSL levels. So they're at BSL or ASL 2+, rapidly heading to 3, but gave the impression that they would know a query that was dangerous when they heard it. And so that reminded me of what Jackson just referenced. Your thoughts on that? And then Rocco, you really mentioned that the greatest risk is accidental at this point. It's not going to be, may not be intentional. It's going to be accidental because the biotech race to make medicine safer crops, more efficient crops is driving an economy. that we all talk about. But the accidental element of this, can you say a little bit more about that? And then the theft that you also mentioned in your opening remarks, and sort of how big those components are, and sort of is there a geographical mapping of that that might go to the GIS capabilities you were talking about? Thanks.
Does anyone else want to start first, or? Okay, I mean, well, so speaking to the AI safety levels, I think the AI community itself has invested pretty significantly in doing a number of experiments, both completely in silico, so just on paper, but also in wet labs to understand what I was just talking about, like how easily non-sophisticated actors can use AI to replicate biological experiments that we already know how to do. And I think yes, we're quickly coming on to a point where I would say this calendar year, we're going to have AI systems that could basically describe to a non-scientist how to make not just a biological agent, but a biological weapon. And that has a couple of different flavors to it. I think already we see the systems sophisticated enough to be able to tell a biological scientist how to do the steps related to how to make a biological agent into a biological weapon. So someone already knows science to do those additional steps, because they'd be able to ask technical questions in a specific way to get there potentially. And if they're not there right now, which actually I think there's a good chance they already are, it's just a couple months from now. And then related to that, I think the problem with unsophisticated actors getting uplift is that they're unable to articulate detailed and technical enough questions for the systems to get good enough answers back. That their ability the AI system's ability to synthesize and to anticipate what you're asking and to give you information that you didn't exactly ask for is also changing extremely rapidly. Once again, that's something I think we'll see by the end of the calendar year. Just looking from when we started doing these detailed investigations about almost exactly 2 years ago on a test that we created of virology that spanned like many different viruses and all kinds of things. And we compared it to both undergraduates and PhD and postdoc level virologists. When we first started, they were basically, this AI systems were at the undergraduate level. Now they're beating our panel of 10 postdocs. And that's 2 years. And I actually forgot what your second question was. And that was very long-winded. So maybe we want to just go on, or what do you want to do? Okay, sorry.
That's perfect. Like, just in the interest of let's take our next question then. Thank you.
First, a quick reaction to the question about how we build humility in, and I would suggest there are two elements. One, when you're talking about the idea of analytical frameworks for evaluating risk specifically, one would be always have an other bucket. In other words, I don't care what your set of definitions or tests are, something is going to come along that doesn't fit them. And if you can see that there are risks or problems and you exclude it simply because it doesn't meet the criteria, it's fundamentally irresponsible. But that's what we normally set up our systems to do. The second piece is simply sensitivity analysis. How impactful are the assumptions and the data we are plugging in? If we vary it, is the response robust or not? Does that change how we think about it? And there's certainly, some practice of doing that, but not enough in this particular kind of an oversight context, I think. But that leads to the question I have about these kind of oversight frameworks. If we don't want to hold up science, I think most of us don't, that has to be dispersed, right? You can't do it all centrally. Just take too long. That means a variety of groups of people have to be able to take this framework and do something similar with it. And the track record with that is really poor. And the question is twofold. One is, if every group that tries to apply the same set of criteria to the same experiment comes up with a different answer, is that structured framework any bloody use at all? My initial argument would be hell no. And the other is, what degree of convergence do you think you would need? Because you're never going to get 100%.
Mike, do you want to reflect on that, having recently been involved in a report that looks at frameworks for AI?
Sure. So I guess I want to start off, I want to disagree a little bit with Rocco about the uplift that AI can achieve, and even by the end of the year. Because, you know, as a virologist, I can tell you, viruses are very finely tuned entities. They've had millions of years to evolve with their hosts. And so while AI does not have the data to know what makes a virus, even just a replicating entity, much less a pathogenic entity. And unless those data become available, it's going to be very hard to train AI models to be able to recapitulate that. So I disagree with the time frame there, at least. I'm not saying that's never going to happen, Rocco, but until we have a lot more data that is useful to train these models, I just don't see that happening. And that was the consensus of the committee. So I think that's one thing I want to just, you know, give kind of a counter argument about.
Yeah, I think one thing, Mike, I think we're in agreement there. I agree 100% that the tools aren't there yet to design something novel. What I was talking about is helping someone already to just reproduce the science that has already existed forever, working with wild type viruses. It's just like teaching them how to, you know, do cell culture, for instance.
Oh, yeah. That's different, though, from an AI uplift in making something worse, right? I think.
Yeah, it's about teaching someone how to do something we already know is bad.
Yeah. Okay. And sorry, can I ask that last speaker to just repeat the question, because I was sort of more focused on what Rocco had said.
Well, and I think that really had to do too with the sensitivity analysis in terms of, you know, having a framework or an approach that can be used sort of in at least a somewhat consistent manner by various different groups, so that if you, like, how would you assure that these frameworks are going to give you somewhat consistent answers across different user communities who might be assessing the same experiment?
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Katie. Yeah, so I think that the 2018 report goes into a lot more detail in that sense, in terms of defining the different parameters that can contribute to whether or not something is a threat, you know, or how big of a threat it might be relative to some other threat. And I think what both reports also share is the realization that, again, you know, each of these reports is a snapshot in time. And as we've talked about a lot today, it's rapidly developing. The field's rapidly developing. And so what both committees try to do is to present ways of looking at capabilities at any given time, whether it's today, the end of this year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and ask the kinds of questions that will then allow the individuals who have to make these decisions to make an informed decision, right? So what are the sort of, you know, barriers that exist today that, if they are widened, right, no matter when that is, you know, 5 years from now, tomorrow, then here's what we need to do to deal with that. So to try to, you know, kind of build in this sort of what we call in the current report an if-then mentality of how to approach these things is how we suggest dealing with these kinds of sensitivities.
Oh, thank you. Now we are literally at like the last second of time. So I know we have both Gigi and Nancy in the room. I'm going to invite them to maybe speak their question, both of them together, and maybe our panelists can just make any final reactions in response to those two questions.
So Mike eloquently talked about our report that describes how AI helps in the design phase of an experiment, but not so much in the actual execution of it, and how there's a lot of unknowns, including, you know, with a pathogen, it's not just the pathogen, it's the host, it's the environment, it's the other animals. So there's a lot of unknowns here that need to be, but just to highlight that, you know, many of the things that you referred to that, you know, could teach somebody to make something more dangerous are present today. And so Mike also referred to the 2018 report, where it says basically like, you know, how are we adding to the risk? And right now we have YouTube, we have Google, well, Google's not as useful anymore, but like, you know, we have things to be able to teach people. I will point out, though, as an educator, that teaching people is a little harder than that, and then you make it sound. So I think that it's, you know, that we just need to keep this in mind, that it's not the risks are not as maybe as extreme as that was describing.
Yeah, sort of related. So I hate to be the last speaker here, but Liz Heitman called in and said responsible conduct of research, which the NIH started in the 1980s, is there and present. And it would be interesting at some point to have you critique people who have gone through that course and not gone through that course. And the idea of hearing about humility from Chris Park, who is the humblest. No, I meant the other way. No, who really is big brain, eloquent, and the most humble and wonderful person that we've had, up in front of us. And thank you for everything. So anyway.
I think that's actually a lovely conclusion. I'm literally going to just see if anybody on the panel wants one sentence to sort of wrap us out, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Board on Life Sciences. Does anyone have sort of a one sentence conclusion? Rocco, you.
Yeah, Gigi, I think you basically highlighted the importance of controls. And so the uplift studies that were done had all the un-AI assisted people access to Google, YouTube, Jove, our medRxiv, all the other sources. And so in many experiments, you can still see an uplift versus everything else. The bottom line is there's not other systems that you can ask what you should know and it can tell you, or ask it, hey, I want to do viral rescue, but I'm really bad at it. Rank the select agent viruses in order of ease of rescue for me and get an answer. You can't Google that. That's all. You could ask a human, yes, but hopefully they won't tell you.
Maria, I just wanted to know if you wanted to maybe reflect briefly for a sentence on Nancy's last point about the importance of responsible conduct of research, since I think that aligns so closely with what you've been teaching.
Yeah, certainly I would like to. I think that it's difficult to teach how to be responsible, but it's easier to explain why you have to be responsible. And also to always speak with the student honestly and show that we do what we are saying that they should do. Like wash the hands with the soap. Or, for example, I use methods to do everything or in a structure. So I show my students my presentation so they see that I do what I am asking them to do. And by that, I think that we are slowly by steady growing and creating a community that is aware of the importance of the responsible science and behave in the right way.
Yes, Julie.
My last thought is I just want to reflect on something that we hear a lot from the Global Health Security Agenda, Biosecurity Action Package, APP3. We've done a lot of awareness raising about risks and threats of AI and bio. We hear a lot from our members from all over the world that their awareness is raised. They're super aware. They're aware. What are they supposed to do with that awareness? Where is the guidance to act on that awareness and to begin establishing a framework that is flexible enough to continue to change as technologies evolve at a rapid pace, but solid enough that they can repeat it at every level of institution and every level of government. I think that last part is a task for all of us to take on. It's a good task for the next couple of years to lay a foundation for the next 50. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think then I'm going to literally close this panel out because I think we, again, could have this conversation forever. And I'm going to turn it back to our host to thank them for this really wonderful event.
Thank you. And thanks to the panelists. I hate to be the bad guy. Sorry, guys. Thank you all so much for coming today. This has been a really, really fantastic discussion. I'm so glad we were able to meet to have this conversation. I want to just one more time thank our speakers and moderators who helped to make this such a wonderful morning and afternoon.